Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Thomas Ravencroft, and I've been a ranger at Jefferson National Forest for 16 years. I've tracked bears through winter storms, relocated mountain lions that wandered too close to campgrounds, and pulled lost hikers off these Virginia ridges more times than I can count. In all those years, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was October of 1979 when everything changed. The leaves were just starting to turn, and there was that crisp bite in the air that meant winter wasn't far behind. I was working Devil's Backbone Ridge, about 18 miles from the nearest town. It's rough country up there. Thick laurel bushes, rocky cliffs, and hemlock trees so old they were saplings when the Cherokee still hunted these hills. My grandmother on my mother's side was Cherokee. She used to tell me stories about things that lived in these mountains, creatures she called raven mockers. According to her, they were soul thieves that could take on any shape they wanted. As a kid, I figured they were just scary stories to keep me from wandering off into the woods alone at night. Looking back now, I wish I'd listened closer. The trouble started with the livestock killings. Farmers down in the valley began calling the ranger station, reporting strange attacks on their animals. At first, it seemed like standard predator activity, probably a mountain lion or maybe a black bear getting ready for winter. But when I drove out to examine the kill sites, nothing made sense. The animals were drained completely of blood, but there were no bite marks on their necks. No claw marks either. Even stranger, there were no tracks leading to or from the bodies. The kills were always arranged in perfect circles. 3 dead chickens here, 2 goats there, all positioned like someone had placed them deliberately. My partner Jake Millerton came with me to investigate. Jake was a good man, been on the job for 8 years. He had sandy hair, a quick laugh, and knew these mountains almost as well as I did. He grew up hunting and fishing every creek and hollow for 20 miles in any direction. "Never seen anything like this," Jake said, as we knelt beside a dead calf on the Morrison farm. The animal lay in the center of a ring of smaller stones, each one placed exactly 2 feet from the next. "What kind of predator arranges rocks?" I ran my hand through the grass around the calf. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding tracks. A field mouse couldn't have crossed this area without leaving some sign, but there was nothing, not even our own footprints showed up properly. It was like the earth itself was refusing to hold marks in this spot. "Maybe kids playing some kind of prank?" Jake suggested, but his voice didn't carry much conviction. "Kids didn't drain this animal," I replied. The calf couldn't have weighed less than 300 pounds, and there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere on the ground. Whatever did this, it's not in any textbook. We spent the rest of that day setting up trail cameras around the kill site. Standard procedure called for 24-hour surveillance when dealing with unknown predators. The cameras were motion activated, with infrared capability for night shots. If something came back, we'd get pictures. That evening, I drove home to my cabin, thinking about my grandmother's stories. She'd been dead for 5 years, but I could still hear her voice telling me about the old days, when the Cherokee knew how to protect themselves from the things that hunted in darkness. "The raven mockers are hungry spirits," she used to say. "They wear the faces of people you trust, but underneath, they're all rot and feathers and sharp teeth. They come for the life force, Tommy. They drink souls like water." At the time, it had seemed like folklore, ancient superstition, from a time when people didn't understand the natural world. But sitting in my truck, looking up at the dark ridge where we'd found that calf, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The radio crackled with static as I tried to check in with dispatch. All I got was white noise and what sounded almost like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I tried 3 more times before giving up and driving home in silence. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching my cabin from the tree line. The next morning, Jake and I hiked back up to check the trail cameras. It was one of those perfect October days. Clear sky, warm sun, leaves crunching under our boots. The kind of day that makes you glad to work outdoors. But as we got closer to the Morrison farm, the forest started feeling wrong. First thing I noticed was the silence. No bird song, No rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no insects buzzing around. Just the sound of our footsteps and our breathing. Even the wind seemed to have died away completely. "You hear that?" Jake asked, stopping on the trail. "I don't hear anything. That's the problem." Jake nodded, looking around nervously. "Where are all the animals?" When we reached the cameras, my hands were shaking as I removed the memory cards. Animals don't just vanish from entire sections of forest. There's always something moving, always some sign of life. The complete absence of sound felt like a warning. Back at the ranger station, we loaded the images onto my computer. The first dozen shots were normal. A raccoon investigating the area, a few deer passing through, nothing unusual. Then came the photos from around midnight. The first strange image showed a figure walking across the frame on all fours. From the back, it looked almost human, but it was moving like an animal, hands and feet touching the ground with each step. The next shot caught it standing upright, facing the camera directly. My blood went cold. The thing had a human shape, but the face was all wrong. The eyes glowed with their own light, reflecting the camera flash like a cat's eyes, but bigger and brighter. The features were twisted, like someone had tried to copy a human face from memory and gotten the proportions wrong. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered. The final image in the sequence showed the figure right up against the camera, one hand pressed against the lens. The hand looked normal, 5 fingers, human proportions. But there was something about the angle that made my stomach turn. It was like the thing's arm was too long, reaching from farther away than should have been possible. "Could be someone in a costume," I said, but I didn't believe it. The way the figure moved in the shots, the unnatural gleam of those eyes, the complete wrongness of its posture. No human could fake that. We decided to go back to the site for another look. This time, we brought our sidearms and extra batteries for the flashlights. The sun was starting to set as we reached the Morrison farm, painting the sky orange and red behind the ridgeline. The dead calf was gone, not dragged away, gone. There were no drag marks, no blood trail, nothing to indicate how a 300-pound animal had been moved. The circle of stones remained exactly as we'd left them, but the center was now empty except for a small pile of black feathers. Jake picked up one of the feathers, and I immediately wished he hadn't. The moment his fingers touched it, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. Our breath began steaming in the suddenly frigid air. "Jake, put that down. It's just a feather, Tom, probably from a crow or something, but it wasn't from any crow I'd ever seen." The feather was nearly a foot long, glossy black with an oily sheen that seemed to shift colors in the dying light. When Jake held it up to examine it closer, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Somewhere in the forest behind us, someone was calling my name. "Tom, Tom, where are you?" It was Jake's voice. I turned to look at him, but Jake was standing right next to me, still holding the feather. His mouth wasn't moving. "Tom, I need help." The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, definitely Jake's voice, but with a strange echo to it, like someone shouting from the bottom of a well. Jake had gone very pale. "That's not me calling," he said quietly. "I know." The voice came again, closer this time. "Tom, something's wrong. I can't find the trail." I grabbed Jake's arm. "We're leaving, now." But as we turned to head back down the mountain, we heard footsteps crashing through the brush, coming toward us fast. Heavy footsteps, like someone running in panic. "Tom, Tom, wait for me." The voice was getting closer, but in the growing darkness, we couldn't see anything moving in the trees. Just the sound of someone, or something, rushing through the forest, calling my name in Jake's voice. We ran. I've never been so glad to see our truck as I was that evening. We jumped in, locked the doors, and I gunned the engine without bothering to warm it up. As we drove away from the Morrison farm, I kept checking the rearview mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the edge of the headlight beams, watching us go. It looked exactly like Jake. When we got back to town, we went straight to the diner for coffee and tried to make sense of what had happened. Jake kept rolling that black feather between his fingers, turning it over and over like he couldn't stop touching it. "Maybe we should call this in," he said. "Get some backup up there." "And tell them what? That something's impersonating you in the woods?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different somehow. Softer, with a strange rhythm to it. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he said. About things that lived in these mountains before the white settlers came, spirits that could wear any face they wanted. I stared at him. In 8 years of working together, Jake had never once mentioned his grandmother, or stories, or anything about Cherokee folklore. "I didn't know you had Cherokee blood," I said carefully. Jake smiled, but something about his expression made my chest tighten. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Tom." That night, I went home and loaded my shotgun. Over the next 3 days, Jake started acting strange. Little things at first, forgetting conversations we'd had, using words he'd never used before, talking about places in the forest that didn't exist. He began speaking Cherokee phrases under his breath, which was impossible because Jake barely spoke Spanish, let alone any native languages. On Thursday morning, we went back up to Devil's Backbone to check for more livestock killings. 3 more farms had reported losses, all with the same impossible characteristics. Bloodless animals arranged in patterns, no tracks, no explanation. As we hiked up the ridge, I noticed Jake walking differently. His gait had changed, becoming smoother, more fluid, like he was gliding over the rough terrain instead of climbing it. When I pointed out a deer trail I wanted to investigate, he turned toward me with movements that seemed too quick, too sharp. "Good eyes," he said, but his voice had that same strange echo I'd heard, calling my name in the forest. We found fresh kill sites at 3 different locations. Each one was worse than the last. Not just single animals now, but entire flocks of chickens, groups of sheep, even a horse that had somehow been drained of every drop of blood and arranged at the center of a perfect spiral made from smooth river stones. "How are the stones getting here?" I asked, kneeling beside the dead horse. "These came from the creek, but that's 2 miles down the mountain." Jake didn't answer. When I looked up, he was standing, completely motionless, about 20 feet away, staring into the forest with his back to me. His head was tilted at an angle that hurt to look at, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Jake?" He turned around slowly, too slowly, like his neck was rotating independently of his body. When he faced me, his eyes reflected the afternoon sunlight for just a moment. The same unnatural gleam I'd seen in the trail camera photos. "We should split up," he said. "Cover more ground that way." Every instinct I had screamed against that idea. We stick together. That's protocol. Something passed across Jake's face. Annoyance, maybe, or hunger. "I know these woods, Tom. I can handle myself," I said. "We stick together." For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. Instead, he smiled that wrong smile again and nodded. "Of course. You're right." But as we continued our patrol, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. Twice, I could have sworn I saw Jake standing in 2 different places at the same time. That evening, as we drove back to town, Jake asked me about my family. "Your wife still teaching at the elementary school?" I'd been divorced for 3 years. Jake knew that. He'd been at the divorce party, for Christ's sake. "I don't have a wife anymore, Jake, remember?" He blinked slowly, like he was searching through memories that didn't quite fit. "Right. Sorry. I'm tired." When I dropped him off at his apartment, I watched him walk to the door. Just before he went inside, he turned and waved. His arm moved like it had too many joints in it. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Once inside my cabin, I called my grandmother's old friend, Mary Crow Feather. She was one of the few Cherokee elders still alive who remembered the old stories. "Mrs. Crow Feather, this is Thomas Ravencroft. I need to ask you about something my grandmother used to tell me." "Tommy? Is that you? I haven't heard from you since the funeral." Her voice was warm but cautious. "What kind of something?" "Raven mockers. She said they could take on human shapes." The line went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Where are you, Tommy?" "At home. Why?" "Lock your doors. Put sage and tobacco around the windows if you have any. Don't let anyone in tonight, no matter who they say they are." "Mrs. Crow Feather, what are—" "A raven mocker feeds on life force, but first it has to get close. It studies people, learns to copy them perfectly. The person you think you know, they might be gone already." My blood turned to ice water. "Gone? The spirits wear their faces, but the real person. They take them to the sacred places, the old caves where the bones are kept. That's where they feed." I thought, about Jake's changed behavior, his impossible knowledge of Cherokee language, the way he moved like something that had learned to be human but hadn't quite mastered it. How do I stop it? You don't stop it, Tommy. You survive it. And you pray it hasn't gotten too strong. That night, I sat in my kitchen with my shotgun across my knees and sage burning on the windowsills. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on my porch. Slow, deliberate steps that circled the cabin 3 times before stopping at my front door. A soft knock. Then Jake's voice, muffled through the wood. "Tom, are you awake? I need to talk to you." I didn't answer. "Tom, I know you're in there. Something's happened. Something bad." The voice was perfect. Exactly Jake's tone, his rhythm, his way of speaking. If I hadn't talked to Mary Crow Feather, I would have opened the door without hesitation. "Tom, please, I found something up on the ridge. About those killings. You need to see this." I sat perfectly still, not even breathing loud enough to be heard. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away from the door. I heard them circle the cabin again, slower this time. Like whatever was out there was testing every window, every possible way in. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. Every shadow outside seemed to move. Every creak of the old cabin made me grip the shotgun tighter. Just before dawn, I heard one more sound that made my skin crawl. From somewhere in the forest behind my house came the sound of Jake's voice, singing an old Cherokee death song in perfect, ancient dialect. The real Jake had never been able to carry a tune. The next morning, I drove straight to Mary Crow Feather's house. She lived in a small cabin outside town, surrounded by herb gardens and wind chimes made from deer bones. When she opened the door, she took one look at my face and nodded grimly. "It came to you. Last night, it sounded exactly like him." She invited me in for coffee and sweet bread, but her hands shook as she poured. "How long has your friend been acting strange?" 3 days, maybe 4, ever since he touched that black feather we found." Mary set down her cup hard enough to splash coffee on the table. "He touched a raven mocker feather? Oh, Tommy, that's how they mark their prey. But he's still alive. I saw him yesterday." "No." Her voice was firm. "You saw it wearing his face. The real man is probably in the caves up on Devil's Backbone, hanging between life and death while the creature feeds on his spirit a little at a time. That's how they stay strong enough to maintain the disguise." I felt sick. Jake wasn't just in danger, he was already a victim, and I'd been working alongside the thing that took him for days. "Can I get him back?" Mary studied my face for a long moment. "Maybe. If you can find where it's keeping him, and if you can perform the binding ritual before it finishes feeding. But Tommy, the creature will know you're coming. It's been learning from your friend's mind. It knows how you think, how you move, what you're afraid of." She went to an old wooden chest and pulled out a leather pouch filled with herbs. A piece of flint, and what looked like a deer antler carved with symbols. "Sage, tobacco, and red cedar," she said, handing me the pouch. "Burn them together when you find the creature's true form. The antler is for protection. Keep it with you at all times. And Tommy, whatever you see up there, whatever it shows you, remember that raven mockers are liars. They'll try to confuse you, make you doubt what's real." I thanked her and headed for the mountains. The drive up to Devil's Backbone felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every shadow in the forest seemed too dark. Every bird call sounded wrong. The radio in my truck produced only static and strange whispers in languages that hurt to hear. I parked at the trailhead and hiked up toward the area where we'd found the first dead animals. This time, I was looking for caves. Cherokee burial caves, the kind of sacred places where spirits might hide their victims. It didn't take long to find tracks. Not animal prints, human footprints that appeared and disappeared randomly, sometimes showing up in soft dirt, sometimes pressed into solid rock where no track should be possible. I followed them deeper into the ridge, past places I'd never explored in 16 years of working this territory. The forest grew stranger as I climbed. Trees leaned away from the path like they were trying to avoid something. The air smelled of death and old feathers. My compass spun wildly, and the GPS unit showed my location as void, no matter where I stood. Then I heard Jake's voice calling for help. Tom, over here. I found something." The voice was coming from a narrow ravine about 50 yards to my left. As I approached, I could see a dark opening in the rock face, a cave entrance partially hidden by fallen boulders. "Tom, hurry! It's incredible!" I pulled out the antler Mary had given me and gripped it tight. The moment my fingers touched the carved bone, Jake's voice changed. "Tuum." The words stretched out like a dying breath, becoming something that definitely wasn't human. "I'm waiting." I climbed down into the ravine and approached the cave entrance. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but the darkness inside seemed deeper than it should be, like looking into a well with no bottom. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave opened up immediately into a large chamber filled with the most horrible thing I've ever seen. Bones covered the floor, not just animal bones, but human remains arranged in complex patterns around a central pit. And hanging from the ceiling on crude hooks made from twisted metal were 3 bodies. Jake was in the middle, barely alive, his skin gray and sunken like something had been slowly draining the life out of him. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when my light hit his face, he tried to speak but only managed a weak whisper. "Tom, it's been wearing my face." The other 2 bodies I didn't recognize, but they were in even worse shape. One looked like it had been hanging there for months. As I moved toward Jake, something dropped from the ceiling behind me. I spun around and came face to face with the thing that had been pretending to be my partner. It still looked like Jake, but wrong in every detail. The skin was too pale, the eyes too bright, and when it smiled, I could see that its teeth went back much farther than they should, row after row of sharp points disappearing into its throat. "Hello, Tom," it said in Jake's voice. "Thanks for coming. I was getting hungry again." The creature began to change as I watched. Its skin darkened and split, revealing black feathers underneath. Its arms stretched and expanded into massive wings, each one spanning at least 12 feet. The Jake face melted and reformed into something with a hooked beak and eyes like burning coals. The raven mocker stood 8 feet tall, a nightmare combination of human and bird, with partially decomposed flesh hanging from its bones in strips. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through a graveyard. "Your friend has been very helpful," it said, gesturing toward the real Jake with one clawed hand. "His memories were particularly tasty. I know all about you now, Tom. Your fears, your failures, your dead father who never thought you'd amount to anything." I fumbled for the herb pouch with shaking hands. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think those old superstitions will save you? I am older than your grandmother's grandmother. I fed on Cherokee warriors when this land was still theirs." But as I pulled out the sage and tobacco, the thing took a step backward. When I struck the flint and lit the herbs, it actually hissed and spread its wings defensively. "Sacred smoke," I said, remembering Mary's words. "You can't cross sacred smoke." The raven mocker's eyes blazed brighter. "Perhaps not, but I don't need to cross it to kill you." The creature opened its beak and screamed. The sound hit me like a physical blow, dropping me to my knees as waves of despair washed over my mind. I could feel my life force being pulled out of me, drawn toward that horrible mouth like water down a drain. Everything started going gray at the edges. My chest felt hollow, like something was scooping out my insides. But I kept the sacred herbs burning, held the deer antler tight, and forced myself to remember Mary's instructions. "Cherokee death song," I gasped, trying to recall the words my grandmother had taught me years ago. "Honor the dead, bind the spirit, send it to the place of waiting." I began chanting in broken Cherokee, probably getting half the words wrong, but the effect was immediate. The raven mocker's scream cut off abruptly, and it staggered backward as if I'd struck it. "Impossible," it snarled. "You don't have the blood, the training." "I have enough." I continued chanting, feeding more herbs into the fire. The sacred smoke filled the cave, and wherever it touched the creature's skin, black feathers fell away like burned paper. The raven mocker made one final desperate lunge toward me, but as it reached the wall of smoke, its body simply dissolved. Not into mist or shadow, but into nothing, like it had never existed at all. The cave fell silent except for Jake's labored breathing. I cut him down from the hooks and carried him outside. By the time we reached the truck, he was conscious enough to speak. "How long?" he asked weakly. 4 days, felt like years. He looked around at the forest with new eyes, like he was seeing it for the first time. "Tom, there are things in these mountains. Old things. This wasn't the only one." As I drove him to the hospital, Jake told me what he'd experienced while the Raven Mocker fed on him. Visions of ancient times, when dozens of the creatures lived in the deep caves and hunted the Cherokee. Sacred places that had been forgotten, protective rituals that were no longer practiced, boundaries that were slowly failing. "It's not over," he said as the medical team took him away. "What we saw up there, it's just the beginning." Jake recovered, mostly. The doctors couldn't explain why he'd lost 40 pounds in 4 days, or why his hair had gone completely white. They called it severe malnutrition and traumatic stress, and left it at that. I never told them what really happened. I also never filed an official report about the incident. How do you explain to federal supervisors that your partner was kidnapped by a shape-shifting soul eater? Instead, I wrote up the livestock killings as predation by unknown species, and recommended the area be monitored for unusual wildlife activity. But things changed for both Jake and me after Devil's Backbone. I started working with Mary Crowfeather and other Cherokee elders, learning about the old protective rituals and how to recognize supernatural threats. Jake transferred to a desk job in the city. He couldn't handle being in the deep forest anymore, couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching from the shadows. As for me, I've become something of an unofficial guardian for this region. The federal government doesn't exactly know about supernatural predators, but there are a few people in the right places who understand that some rangers encounter things that don't fit in the official manuals. I get the special cases now. The unexplained disappearances, the impossible animal attacks, the reports that make other rangers shake their heads and reach for rational explanations. I've learned to burn sage and tobacco around my cabin every night. I keep the deer antler Mary gave me on a chain around my neck, and I never, ever investigate strange incidents alone. Because Jake was right, the Raven Mocker wasn't the only one. Over the past few years, I've encountered other things in these mountains: shadow people that hunt during new moon periods, water spirits that drown hikers in streams barely ankle deep, ancient bear spirits that can tear a man in half but leave no physical evidence behind. The Cherokee knew how to live alongside these creatures, how to respect the boundaries and maintain the protections that kept both worlds in balance. But most of that knowledge died with the elders, and the boundaries are breaking down. Last month, I found another set of black feathers arranged in a circle near a campground. 3 hikers had gone missing from that area the week before. Their bodies were never found. I burned the feathers and performed the binding ritual Mary taught me, but I could feel something watching from the forest as I worked. Something that laughed like breaking glass and whispered promises of revenge in a voice that sounded almost familiar. If you ever find yourself hiking in the Appalachian Mountains, especially around the old Cherokee lands, and you come across black feathers arranged in patterns, don't touch them. Don't investigate. Just leave the area immediately, and don't come back after dark. Some things are older than our understanding, hungrier than our imagination, and far more patient than we can comprehend. The mountains remember everything, and they're full of creatures that remember us. I still patrol Devil's Backbone Ridge, but I'm not alone anymore. Mary introduced me to a network of people who understand what's really out there. Other rangers, tribal elders, historians who study the old accounts. We keep watch, maintain the protections where we can, and try to keep the ancient hungers from spilling over into the modern world. But every night, when I lock my doors and light the sacred herbs, I can feel something out there in the darkness, waiting, learning, growing stronger. The Raven Mockers are just the beginning, and I have the terrible feeling that something much worse is stirring in the deep places, something that makes soul-eating spirits look like minor nuisances. My grandmother used to say that the old agreements were weakening, that the boundaries between worlds were wearing thin. She died before she could teach me everything I needed to know. Now I'm learning the hard way that she was right about more than just the Raven Mockers. They're all coming back. My name is Rebecca Ironheart, and I've been a winter rescue ranger in Monongahela National Forest for 12 years now. I've pulled people out of avalanches, found lost hikers in blizzards that would freeze your breath solid, and treated frostbite so bad the fingers looked like black twigs. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Whiteface Mountain in February of '85. I grew up in a logging family. My daddy and his daddy before him worked these mountains when the big companies were still cutting old growth. They'd tell stories around the fire about the hungry winters, when food ran short and men went missing. Sometimes they'd find bones with strange marks, teeth gouges too big for any bear. The old-timers called it the curse of the hungry giant. I always figured it was just stories to keep us kids from wandering too far in winter. Whiteface Mountain sits at 4,200 feet, covered in thick spruce forest that blocks out the sun even in summer. In winter, it's like stepping into another world, one made of ice and shadows, and silence so deep it makes your ears ring. The old logging camps are still up there, abandoned for 50 years, but somehow still standing, like the cold preserved them. That February, we got hit with the worst blizzard in state history. 8 feet of snow in 3 days, temperatures dropping to 25 below. The wind was howling so loud it sounded like voices screaming in the trees. Most folks had enough sense to stay inside and wait it out. But 5 cross-country skiers from Virginia didn't get the memo. They'd planned a week-long winter camping trip through the backcountry. Good gear, experienced outdoors, people, emergency beacons, everything you'd want for a safe trip. Except they were 3 days overdue, and their families were getting worried. My partner Dave Ashford and I got the call on Thursday morning. Dave's been with the service for 8 years. Good man, steady hands in a crisis. We've worked together so long we barely need to talk on a rescue. He knows mountain first aid better than most doctors, and I trust him with my life. Signals are weird, Beck, Dave said, studying the emergency beacon readout in our truck. The beacons are active, but they're moving in patterns that don't make sense. Like they're going straight up cliff faces. I checked the map. The signals were coming from impossible places, vertical rock walls that no human could climb in these conditions. Maybe the cold's messing with the electronics, I said, but my gut was telling me something else. We loaded our packs with everything we'd need for a 3-day search. Avalanche gear, medical supplies, winter shelter, enough food for 7 people. The snowshoes went on before we even left the truck. The snow was so deep you'd disappear up to your chest without them. The first thing I noticed wrong was the silence. Not just quiet silence. In 12 years of winter rescue, I'd never been in forest this dead. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no signs of any wildlife at all. Even the wind seemed muffled, like the trees were holding their breath. Where are all the animals? Dave asked, scanning the empty woods around us. I didn't have an answer. Animals know things we don't. When they disappear, there's usually a reason. We followed the beacon signals deeper into the mountain. The trail wound through spruce groves so thick the snow barely reached the ground beneath them. Our snowshoes crunched with each step, the only sound in the dead world around us. After 2 hours of climbing, Dave stopped and pointed up. Beck, look at that tree. 20 feet above us, a pair of bright blue skis hung from a spruce branch like Christmas ornaments. The bindings were still attached, the poles tangled in the needles above them. There was no way they could have gotten there naturally. You'd need a helicopter to hang gear that high. Maybe an avalanche threw them up there, Dave suggested, but his voice didn't sound convinced. I studied the tree. The bark was stripped away in long, parallel gouges from about 8 feet up to 15 feet high. The marks looked fresh, wood still white and bleeding sap. What kind of animal strips bark that high up? Dave shook his head. Bears hibernate in winter. Mountain lions don't climb that high to feed. We kept moving, following the signals toward the old logging camp marked on our map. But every few hundred yards, we found more gear scattered in impossible places. A sleeping bag frozen solid around a tree trunk 12 feet off the ground. A camping stove embedded in ice on a vertical rock face. A backpack hanging from a cliff edge we couldn't even see how to reach. The emergency beacons kept moving ahead of us, always just out of range. Every time we thought we were getting close, the signals would jump another half-mile deeper into the mountains. This doesn't make sense, Dave said, checking his handheld tracker for the 10th time. It's like they're leading us somewhere. That's when we heard the first howl. It started low, almost below hearing, like the rumble of a distant avalanche. Then it rose higher, becoming something between a wolf's howl and a human scream. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the cliff faces and bouncing through the trees until you couldn't tell where it started. Dave and I stood frozen, listening. In all my years in these mountains, I'd never heard anything like it. It raised every hair on my body and made my teeth ache. Wolf pack? Dave whispered. I shook my head. Wolves don't sound like that. And there haven't been wolves in West Virginia for 70 years. The howl came again, closer this time, and something else came with it, a smell like rotting meat left in a freezer. Sweet and sick and wrong. We found the first body an hour later. Marcus Peterson, 28 years old, from Richmond. According to his driver's license, he was sitting upright against a tree, perfectly preserved by the cold. His face looked peaceful, like he'd just sat down to rest. But when we rolled him forward to check for injuries, we saw the back of his skull was gone. Jesus, Dave breathed, stumbling backward. The bone had been cracked open like an eggshell, the contents scooped out clean. But here's the thing that made my hands shake as I took photos for the report. The edges of the skull weren't jagged like an animal attack. They were smooth, almost polished, like something had very carefully opened him up. Around the base of the tree, the snow was stained dark red, but not scattered like you'd expect from an animal feeding. It was arranged in careful patterns, almost decorative, like someone had drawn designs with the blood. "We need to call this in," I said, reaching for my radio. Nothing but static. The mountains block signals sometimes, but we were on a ridge with clear sky. The radio should have worked fine. Dave was examining the tree above Marcus's body. "Beck, look at this." Carved into the bark, about 8 feet up, were symbols I didn't recognize. Not letters, but shapes that hurt to look at, twisted lines that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. "Could be gang signs," Dave said, but his voice was shaking. "Maybe drug dealers using the mountains." I wanted to believe that. Drug dealers made sense. Drug dealers were human, and humans I could handle. But as we stood there, the temperature started dropping. Not gradually, like evening coming on fast, like someone had opened a giant freezer door. Our breath went from invisible to thick clouds in less than a minute. The trees around us began cracking as the sap froze solid, and somewhere in the darkness between the trees, something large was moving toward us. We made camp in a clearing near the old logging station, though camp is generous for what we managed. The temperature had dropped so fast our gear was starting to malfunction. Dave's sleeping bag zipper froze solid, and the propane in our stove barely wanted to light. "I don't like this, Beck," Dave said, trying to get our emergency shelter set up. His hands were shaking, and not just from cold. "The whole situation feels wrong." I agreed. But we had a job to do. 4 more people were still missing, and their beacon signals were still moving somewhere ahead of us. We couldn't turn back until we found them or confirmed they were dead. The logging camp was bigger than I expected. 5 wooden buildings arranged in a rough circle, all of them still standing despite being abandoned since the 1930s. The snow had drifted high against the walls, but the roofs were clear, like something had been keeping them swept clean. "According to the map, there shouldn't be any buildings here," I said, double-checking our position. Dave frowned at his compass. "Map's wrong, I guess. Or, we're more lost than we thought." We approached the largest building, what looked like a mess hall or community room. The door was slightly open, just a crack, but wide enough to see that someone had been inside recently. Fresh boot prints in the dust. Food cans opened and empty, but not rusted. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone in there?" We're park rangers. No answer, but I heard something moving inside. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. Dave pushed the door open with his ski pole, staying back in case of trouble. The inside was dark, but our flashlights showed a large room with long wooden tables and a stone fireplace. On the tables were the remains of several meals, not old ones, but recent. Fresh bones still had meat on them, and the smell. "Oh God," Dave gagged, covering his nose and mouth. The bones weren't animal bones, they were human. Arm bones and leg bones, cracked open for the marrow, rib bones with teeth marks, and skulls, 4 of them lined up on the mantel above the fireplace, like trophies. But here's what made it worse. The teeth marks in the bones were too big for any human mouth. The canine punctures were 2 inches apart, and the molars had left crushing marks that would require jaw strength no person could manage. "We need to get out of here," Dave said, backing toward the door. That's when we heard breathing behind us. We turned around slowly, flashlight beams wavering, and saw him standing in the doorway. At first glance, he looked like one of the missing hikers, tall, wearing winter gear, ice crystals in his beard. But his eyes were wrong. They reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, yellow and bright, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too many. "So hungry," he said in a voice like grinding ice. Been so hungry, but now you're here. Dave fumbled for his radio while I reached for the pepper spray on my belt. But the man or thing that looked like a man moved faster than anything human should move. 1 second he was in the doorway, the next he was right in front of Dave, close enough to touch. "Dave, run!" I shouted, but Dave wasn't moving. He was staring into those yellow eyes like he was hypnotized, and his hand was moving toward the knife on his belt. "Yes," the thing whispered, and its breath made frost flowers bloom on Dave's face. "You understand, don't you? The hunger. How long it's been since you really fed." Dave's pupils were dilated, and when he looked at me, I saw something I'd never seen before in 12 years of working together. He was looking at me like I was food. I hit him with the pepper spray. Dave screamed and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes, and the spell or whatever it was broke. The thing that had been standing next to him was gone, just vanished like it had never been there. "What did you do that for?" Dave gasped, tears streaming down his face from the spray. "You were about to cut me. With your knife," I said, pointing to the blade still in his hand. He looked down at it like he'd never seen it before. "I don't remember." He dropped the knife and sat down hard in the snow. "Beck, I don't remember drawing this. We got out of that camp fast, leaving most of our gear behind. But as we snowshoed away through the trees, I could hear things following us. Footsteps that were too long and too quiet for human feet. Breathing that echoed from multiple directions at once. And Dave kept looking at me sideways, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. By the time we made it to the ridge above the logging camp, Dave was in bad shape. Not from the pepper spray that had worn off hours ago. Something else was wrong with him. He kept stopping to sharpen his knife on rocks, testing the edge against his thumb until it drew blood. And he was talking about food constantly. "When's the last time you had a really good meal, Beck?" he asked, checking his knife edge again. "I mean really good. The kind that fills you up completely." "We ate 4 hours ago, Dave." "No, not that processed camp food. Real meat. Fresh meat." His eyes had that glassy look again, and when he smiled, I swear his teeth looked sharper than before. That's when I understood what we were dealing with. My grandmother had told me stories when I was little, stories her grandmother had passed down from the old country. Stories about people who got so hungry they ate human flesh, and how that changed them into something that could never be satisfied again. Something that needed to feed on people to stay alive. A Wendigo. The emergency beacons were still moving ahead of us, but now I realized they weren't leading us to survivors. They were leading us to the thing's hunting ground, where it was strongest. Where it had been feeding for decades, growing larger and more powerful with every person it consumed. "Dave, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Something is happening to you, something bad. I need you to fight it." He looked at me with those yellow-tinged eyes and smiled. "I am fighting it, Beck. I'm fighting the part of me that doesn't want to hurt you." That's when the real thing showed up. It came out of the trees like a walking nightmare 18 feet tall, skeletal thin, covered in frozen flesh that hung in strips from its bones. Antlers sprouted from its skull like a twisted crown, and its mouth was full of yellowed fangs the size of my fingers. When it breathed, the air around it turned to ice crystals. Dave looked up at it and laughed with joy, like seeing an old friend. "Finally," he whispered. "I was getting so tired of fighting the hunger." The Wendigo spoke, and its voice was like breaking ice. "Feed, little brother, feed and join us. There is so much hunger to share." Dave drew his knife and turned toward me, but his movements were slow and clumsy. The human part of him was still fighting. I had maybe 10 seconds before the Wendigo's influence took over completely. I remembered my grandmother's stories. Fire was the enemy of these things. Light and heat and the warmth of human love, these were the weapons that could drive them back. I pulled the emergency flare from my pack and struck it against the igniter. Bright red fire bloomed in the darkness, and the Wendigo shrieked and staggered backward. The temperature around us jumped 20 degrees in an instant. Dave blinked and looked around confused. "Beck, what's happening? Why do I have my knife out?" "Stay behind me and don't look directly at it," I said, holding the flare between us and the creature. The Wendigo circled us like a wolf, testing the range of the flare's light. Where the red glow touched it, steam rose from its frozen flesh, but flares don't last forever, and we were still miles from help. "You cannot burn forever, little ranger," it hissed. "And when the light dies, you will feed us willingly. The hunger will make you beg to join us." I felt the pull of its words, the promise of never being hungry again, never being cold, never being weak. For a moment, I almost let the flare drop. Then I thought about all the people this thing had killed. The hikers, whose bones decorated its lair. The loggers, who had disappeared decades ago. The families who would never know what happened to their loved ones. "No," I said, and pulled a second flare from my pack. "I choose love over hunger. I choose warmth over cold. And I choose life over whatever you're offering." The Wendigo screamed and launched itself at us, but I was ready. I jammed both flares directly into its chest, and the creature burst into flames like it was made of dried wood. The fire spread across its body faster than should have been possible, consuming the frozen flesh and leaving only blackened bones that crumbled to ash in seconds. Dave collapsed beside me, unconscious but breathing. His color was coming back, and when I checked his pulse, it was strong and steady. As the Wendigo's ashes scattered in the wind, the normal sounds of the forest returned. Birds calling in the distance, wind rustling through the trees, the natural world waking up from whatever spell had held it frozen. But just before the last of the ashes blew away, I heard its voice one final time. "We are never truly gone, Ranger. When the hunger returns, so shall we." They found us 2 days later when the weather finally broke. The official report listed the 5 missing hikers as avalanche victims. Their bodies never recovered. Dave and I were treated for severe frostbite and exposure, but we survived. Dave doesn't remember anything that happened after we found the first body. The doctors say it was trauma-induced amnesia, a common response to extreme stress. I let them believe that. Some things are better forgotten, but I remember everything. The yellow eyes, the sound of ice cracking when the thing spoke, the way the very air turned solid around it. And I remember the promise it made before it died. I keep emergency flares in my pack now, even in summer. White phosphorus camping matches, a lighter that works in any weather. Iron tools blessed by my grandmother's priest. People think I'm paranoid, but they didn't see what I saw on Whiteface Mountain. I've also started researching Native American legends about cannibalistic spirits. Historical records of disappearances in remote areas during severe winters, government files that most people don't know exist, documenting things that officially never happened. I'm not the only one. There's a network of park rangers, search and rescue specialists, and mountain guides who've encountered things that can't be explained. We share information quietly, through unofficial channels. We keep track of disappearances that follow certain patterns, and we watch the mountains during the hungry times. Because the thing was right about one thing, they're never truly gone. Every few years, during particularly harsh winters, people disappear in ways that don't make sense. Experienced outdoors, people who know better than to take unnecessary risks. People who vanish without a trace, leaving only scattered gear and sometimes bones with very specific bite marks. The climate is changing. Winters are becoming more extreme and less predictable. More people are using the backcountry for recreation, venturing into areas that were once too remote and dangerous to access. And sometimes, when the wind is just right and the cold cuts deep enough, I can still hear it calling from the high peaks, hungry, patient, waiting for the next person desperate enough to listen. My name is Rebecca Ironheart. I'm a winter rescue ranger with 15 years of experience in extreme conditions. And I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand, if you're ever winter camping in remote mountains and you hear howling, that makes you think about how long it's been since you had a really good meal, get to a fire immediately. Don't trust anyone who suggests you share body heat. And whatever you do, don't listen when the hunger starts to make sense. My name is Samuel Wolfhart, and I've been a ranger at Cherokee National Forest for 18 years. Most folks think being a park ranger is all about telling tourists where the bathrooms are and making sure campfires get put out proper. Truth is, my specialty is cave rescue. When someone gets lost or hurt in the dark places under these Tennessee mountains, I'm the one they call. I wasn't always a ranger. Spent 12 years working coal mines before I came here. Lost my brother Jake in a mine collapse back in '82. That's what drove me to this work. pulling people out of holes in the earth instead of digging deeper into them. I got certifications in technical rope rescue, cave diving, underground emergency medicine, done over 200 cave rescues in these mountains. I know every hole, every passage, every squeeze that'll trap a man if he's not careful. The Cherokee National Forest has more caves than most people realize. Backbone Rock Recreation Area sits right in the heart of it all. There's a natural tunnel carved right through the mountain. Tourists love driving through it, taking pictures. But that's just the front door to something much bigger. Miles and miles of limestone caves twist through these mountains like the veins in a man's arm. July 1988 was the hottest summer I'd ever seen. The drought was so bad it dropped water levels and exposed cave entrances that hadn't seen daylight in decades. That's how the trouble started. 4 experienced cavers found a new passage system behind what used to be an underwater opening. The missing cavers were good people, real experienced. They'd been down in caves from Virginia to Alabama, had all the right gear, knew all the safety protocols. They went down on a Tuesday morning with enough supplies for a day trip, planned to map out maybe 300 feet of new passage, take some photos, be back up by dinner. Wednesday morning came and went. No sign of them. Maria Santos, my rescue partner, and I got the call around noon. Maria's been doing cave rescue almost as long as me, and she's got nerves like steel cable. If something spooks Maria, you know it's serious. Their cars are still in the parking lot, she told me as we loaded our gear. Families are worried sick. Emergency lights are still working. We can see the glow from the entrance, but nobody's answering our calls. The new cave opening was about a quarter mile from the main Backbone Rock tunnel. Soon as we rappelled down to the entrance, I knew something wasn't right. The air was wrong. In normal caves, air flows follow predictable patterns based on temperature and pressure. This air was flowing upward from passages that should have been sealed. And the sounds, our voices, echoed back from depths that shouldn't exist. "Sam?" Maria whispered, checking her radio for the 3rd time. "This thing keeps picking up signals." "Listen." She held out her radio. Instead of static, we heard a rhythmic knocking sound. Tap, 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 pausa. Tap, 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 pausa. Like someone was hitting stone with metal over and over. "Could be the missing cavers," I said, but I didn't believe it. The knocking had a pattern to it that felt old, ancient, like it had been going on long before we got there. We followed their route based on the gear they'd left behind. About 200 feet down, we found their equipment scattered in the strangest way I'd ever seen. Not dropped or abandoned in panic. Arranged. Their helmets sat in a perfect circle. Their ropes were coiled in identical spirals. Their water bottles stood in a straight line, labels all facing the same direction. "Nobody arranges gear like this," Maria said, and her voice was shaking just a little. "Not unless they got all the time in the world." The cave kept going deeper than any of our maps showed. I've been in every major cave system in this part of Tennessee, but this was like discovering a whole new mountain underneath the one we thought we knew. The passages were big enough to drive a truck through, carved smooth like they'd been worked by water for millions of years. That's when we found the first claw marks. 12 feet up the cave wall, gouged deep into solid limestone. Fresh gouges, bright white against the dark stone. 4 parallel lines, each one as wide as my thumb and 3 feet long. Whatever made those marks was bigger than any bear, and strong enough to tear through rock like it was wet clay. "Bears don't climb cave walls," Maria said, running her fingers along the gouges. "And they sure don't scratch limestone." I measured the marks with my tape, 12 feet from the cave floor to the bottom of the scratches. Whatever made them had reached like nothing I'd ever seen. The spacing between the claw marks suggested something with hands the size of dinner plates. We kept following the passage deeper. Our headlamps cut through darkness that felt thick as soup. Every few hundred feet, we'd find more signs that something big had been through here. Disturbed rock formations, boulders pushed aside like they weighed nothing, places where the cave floor was scratched and scored by something heavy being dragged. "Look at this," Maria called from up ahead. She was kneeling next to what looked like a footprint pressed into the soft cave mud, a footprint bigger than a manhole cover. Human-shaped, but wrong. Too long, too wide. Toes that ended in what looked like claws. "That's not possible," I said, but I was already taking pictures. Nothing that size could fit through the passages we just came through. That's when we heard the breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing echoing from somewhere ahead of us. Each breath sounded like wind through a cathedral. We killed our lights and listened. The breathing continued, steady and patient. It was coming from a passage that angled down and to the right, toward what our maps said should be solid rock. Could be one of the missing cavers, Maria whispered, but she didn't sound convinced. We followed the sound. The passage narrowed, forcing us to crawl on hands and knees through a squeeze that barely fit our shoulders. No way anything the size of those footprints could follow us through there. We should have felt safe, but the breathing was getting louder. The squeeze opened up into a chamber the size of a school gymnasium. Our lights swept across formations that took my breath away. Flowstone cascades, cathedral ceilings, columns thick as oak trees. This wasn't on any map. This was a discovery that should have made headlines. And there, arranged around a natural stone altar in the center of the chamber, was gear that didn't belong to our missing cavers. Old gear, really old, canvas packs rotted to scraps, metal equipment rusted beyond recognition, and bones, human bones, scattered around like offerings. Some of them showed massive bite marks, teeth marks from something with a jaw that could crack a man's skull like a walnut. Jesus, Sam, Maria breathed. How long have people been disappearing in here? I picked up a corroded metal tag from one of the old packs. The writing was barely visible, but I could make out a date, 1962. Another tag read 1974. A third one was too corroded to read, but the style of the buckles suggested it was even older. The breathing stopped. Complete silence filled the chamber. Not normal cave silence. This was the silence of something holding its breath, something listening, something waiting. That's when our headlamps started dimming. Fresh batteries, fully charged. Both our lights were dying at the same time. The darkness crept in from the edges of our vision like spilled ink. In the failing light, I saw Maria's face go white. "We need to go," she whispered. "Right now." But as we turned toward the squeeze we'd crawled through, we heard it, a sound like boulders grinding against each other. The sound of something massive moving through stone as easily as a fish moves through water. Our lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness, we heard footsteps. Enormous footsteps, walking slowly around the chamber. Each step shook dust from the ceiling. Each step came closer. I fumbled for my backup light. The beam caught something that made my blood freeze. A shadow moving along the wall. A shadow too big and too wrong to be human. It flowed like water, but it was solid as stone. And it was moving toward us. The squeeze. I hissed to Maria, "Move." We scrambled toward where the passage should be. But in the darkness, everything looked different. The chamber seemed to have grown. The walls we'd mapped minutes before were gone. Instead of the tight squeeze we'd crawled through, we found only smooth stone walls. The passage had sealed itself. And in the darkness behind us, something was breathing again. Breathing like a mountain drawing air into its lungs. Breathing like something that had been waiting underground for a very long time. The creature, and by then I knew it was a creature, not some natural phenomenon, began to circle us in the dark. I could feel its presence like heat from a furnace. Massive, patient, intelligent. Every few seconds, my backup light would catch a glimpse of it. A shoulder the size of a refrigerator. An arm that stretched from floor to ceiling. Skin that looked like living stone, gray and textured like granite. "Samuel Wolfhart," it said. My name. It spoke my name in a voice like grinding millstones. The sound came from everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air itself. "You know the old stories," it continued. "Your people in the Cherokee, they shared these mountains long before the government drew lines on paper." Maria grabbed my arm. She was shaking so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. The creature's voice seemed to come from inside the stone around us, as if the mountain itself was speaking. "The Cherokee called me guardian," it said. "Keeper of the deep places, protector of the bones that rest in sacred chambers. What do you want?" I managed to ask. "The four who came before you," the creature said, and I realized it meant our missing cavers. "They took things. Sacred things. Disturbed places that should remain undisturbed. They violated the agreement your ancestors made with mine." The chamber began to change around us. I could feel the walls shifting, expanding. Passages opened where there had been solid rock. The sound of grinding stone filled the air as the creature reshaped its domain. "I need them back," I said. "The missing people. They have families." The creature's laugh was like an avalanche in slow motion. "They live, but they cannot leave until what was taken is returned, until the violation is corrected, until someone speaks for them with proper authority." "I don't understand. You will learn," it said. "The Cherokee elder, Thomas Crowfeather, he waits above. He knows the old agreements. He knows what price must be paid." The creature began to move away, its massive form flowing through what should have been solid rock. As it moved, new passages opened before it, leading deeper into the mountain. "Follow," it commanded. "See what your missing friends have done. Understand why they cannot be released without payment." We had no choice. The passage behind us remained sealed. Our only option was to follow the creature deeper into the mountain, through caves that shouldn't exist, toward whatever sacred site had been violated. The creature led us through chambers that defied every law of geology I knew, rooms where water flowed upward along the walls, passages where gravity seemed to work sideways, places where the air shimmered with heat despite being hundreds of feet underground. And everywhere, we saw evidence of the creature's power. Massive stone formations that had been shaped like clay, passages that twisted through solid rock in impossible spirals, chambers carved in perfect geometric patterns that no natural force could create. "How long have you been down here?" I asked as we walked. "Since the Cherokee first came to these mountains," the creature replied. "I am their agreement with the deep places, their promise that some things will remain sacred, some places will remain untouched." We came to a passage that angled sharply downward, carved with symbols I'd never seen before. Cherokee pictographs covered the walls, images of humans and creatures, of sacred ceremonies, of agreements between worlds. "Your missing friends found this place 2 days ago," the creature said. "They saw the symbols and knew they had found something special, but they did not see the warning signs. They did not understand what they were entering." At the bottom of the passage was a chamber unlike anything I'd ever seen. Natural stone altars arranged in careful patterns, carved alcoves holding artifacts that were clearly ancient, pottery, tools, ceremonial objects, and scattered around the chamber, obviously out of place, were the missing cavers' packs and equipment. The 4 missing people sat against the far wall, alive but clearly traumatized. Their eyes were wide and staring. They didn't respond when we called their names. "What did you do to them?" Maria demanded. "I showed them the truth," the creature said. "Showed them what happens when sacred places are violated. They cannot unsee what they have seen. They cannot unknow what they now know." I walked over to the missing cavers. They were physically unharmed, but something in their faces told me they'd experienced something that broke their understanding of the world. They stared through me like I wasn't there. "This is a burial chamber," I realized, looking at the carefully arranged artifacts. "Cherokee burial chamber. Sacred to my people for 800 years, the creature confirmed. These 4 found it and saw opportunity instead of reverence. They took photographs. They removed artifacts. They disturbed the resting places of the honored dead. I saw it then, expensive camera equipment, artifact bags, metal detectors. The missing cavers hadn't just been exploring. They'd been treasure hunting, grave robbing. They didn't know, I said, though the words felt hollow. They're not bad people. They just didn't understand. Ignorance is not innocence, the creature replied. The mountain has been marked with warnings for centuries. The Cherokee have posted signs, told stories, shared their traditions with all who would listen. These 4 chose not to listen. The creature began to grow larger, its form expanding until it filled half the chamber. Its stone skin glowed with inner heat, and its eyes burned like coals. "But you, Samuel Wolfhart," it said, "you have Cherokee blood in your veins. Your great-grandmother was mountain woman, daughter of a great Adess. Cherokee healer, you have the right to speak for these trespassers, to negotiate their release." I felt the weight of that revelation settle on my shoulders like a mountain. I'd known my great-grandmother was Cherokee, but I'd never understood what that might mean in a situation like this. "What kind of negotiation?" I asked. The creature's smile revealed teeth like broken stalactites. "A test," it said. Prove that you understand the sacred nature of this place. Prove that you can be trusted to protect it. Do this, and your friends go free. Fail, and they remain here forever, guardians of what they tried to steal. The test the creature had in mind wasn't what I expected. Instead of some physical challenge or fight, it wanted me to navigate the burial chamber using only Cherokee traditional methods. No modern equipment, no electric lights, no ropes or radios. Technology fails in sacred places, the creature explained. Your instruments betray you because they do not understand the spiritual nature of what surrounds them. You must find your way using the guidance your ancestors would have used. Maria started to protest, but the creature silenced her with a gesture. The stone walls began to shift again, creating a labyrinth of passages leading away from the burial chamber. I could hear Thomas Crowfeather's voice echoing from somewhere far above, speaking in Cherokee, guiding me through traditional wayfinding prayers. I'd heard some of those prayers as a child. When my great-grandmother was still alive, she'd taught me to feel the mountain's moods, to read the signs that most people miss. At the time, I thought she was just telling stories. Now, hundreds of feet underground, facing an ancient guardian made of living stone, those childhood lessons became my lifeline. The creature's test led me through passages that defied everything I knew about caving. Tunnels that looped back on themselves. Chambers where the ceiling became the floor. Places where my compass spun wildly and my sense of direction completely failed. But when I stopped relying on instruments and started listening to the mountain itself, feeling the air currents, sensing the subtle changes in temperature and humidity, following the almost imperceptible sounds of underground water, I found I could navigate the impossible maze. Hours passed, maybe days. Time worked differently in the creature's domain. I moved through chambers filled with Cherokee artifacts, past stone formations that recorded the history of the mountain, through passages decorated with pictographs that told stories I was only beginning to understand. Finally, I reached the heart of the mountain. The chamber was vast beyond measurement. The walls disappeared into darkness above and around me. In the center sat a natural throne carved from living rock, and on that throne sat the creature in its true form. 20 feet tall, carved from stone but alive in ways that shouldn't be possible. Its face was ancient beyond imagining, marked by centuries of watching over sacred places. Its eyes held the weight of mountains, the patience of geological time. "You have learned to see," it said. "Now you must choose." "Choose what?" "Your missing friends violated sacred trust. The debt must be paid. But there are different kinds of payment." The creature gestured, and the chamber walls lit up with scenes of the violation. I watched the 4 cavers discover the burial chamber, saw them photograph sacred artifacts, witnessed them packing irreplaceable ceremonial objects into their bags. "They can remain here forever, guardians of what they tried to steal," the creature said. Or what? "You can take their place. One guardian, chosen freely, protects these sacred sites from all future violation. The Cherokee Nation gains a permanent ally in the federal park system. The debt is paid with willing service instead of eternal captivity." I thought about Maria, waiting somewhere above. Thought about the families of the missing cavers. Thought about my 18 years of pulling people out of holes in the earth, and how all of it had led to this moment. "If I agree," I said, "you'll let them go? They will remember nothing of what happened here. They will return to their lives, but they will never again violate sacred places. The mountain will ensure that." I looked around the vast chamber, at the pictographs that told the story of centuries of cooperation between Cherokee people and the guardians of the deep places. I thought about my great-grandmother's stories, about the responsibilities that come with knowing the truth about these mountains. "I accept," I said. The creature's smile was like sunrise on stone. "Then you understand the real choice," it said. "This was never about punishment. It was about finding someone who could bridge 2 worlds. Someone who understands both the technology of your people and the wisdom of mine." The chamber began to change around us. Passages opened, leading back to the surface. The creature began to shrink, taking a more human form while retaining its essential nature of living stone. "You are not my prisoner," it explained. "You are my partner. Together, we will protect these sacred places from those who would harm them, and in exchange, I will help you save those who become lost in the deep places." I understood then that the test had never been about sacrifice. It had been about finding someone who could accept the responsibility of protecting something precious. Someone who could stand between the modern world and the ancient one, ensuring both could coexist. The missing cavers? I asked. Already on their way to the surface, the creature said. Maria is guiding them out. They remember getting lost in a cave system, nothing more. That was 37 years ago. I'm still a ranger at Cherokee National Forest, though my job description has expanded considerably beyond what's written in my personnel file. The government thinks I'm just really good at cave rescue and cultural liaison work. They don't need to know about my partnership with the Guardian of the Deep Places. The 4 cavers we rescued that July lived normal lives. 2 of them became environmental lawyers. 1 started a nonprofit that protects indigenous sacred sites. The 4th became a Cherokee language teacher. None of them remember what really happened in the burial chamber, but all of them developed a deep respect for sacred places they can't quite explain. Maria retired from cave rescue 5 years after the incident. She says she never felt comfortable underground after that day, though she can't put her finger on why. We keep in touch. Sometimes she asks me if I really believe the Cherokee stories about things living in caves. I tell her that after 18 years underground, I've learned that the old stories usually get the important parts right. Thomas Crowfeather and I became close friends. He taught me the proper protocols for working with the Guardian, the ceremonies that keep the partnership strong, the ways to recognize when sacred sites need protection. When he passed on 10 years ago, he made sure the Cherokee Nation Council knew they had an ally in the Park Service. The Guardian keeps its end of our bargain. Cave rescues in the Cherokee National Forest have a higher success rate than anywhere else in the region. Lost cavers find their way to safety, guided by air currents that shouldn't exist and water sounds that lead them to passages they somehow missed before. People who enter caves with disrespectful intentions find themselves turned around and led back to the surface before they can cause harm. I've learned to communicate with the Guardian through stone vibrations, temperature changes, and air pressure shifts. It's become as natural as speaking English. The mountain talks to those who know how to listen. My official job now includes cultural sensitivity training for new rangers, maintaining restricted access protocols around sacred sites, and serving as liaison between the Park Service and the Cherokee Nation. What people don't know is that I spend my nights walking the cave systems, checking on places that need protection, and making sure the agreements between worlds remain strong. The Backbone Rock area gets more visitors every year. Most of them are respectful tourists who appreciate the natural beauty and cultural significance of the place. But occasionally, someone shows up with metal detectors and artifact bags and expensive cameras, thinking they've found a place where they can take whatever they want. Those people find that these mountains have their own ways of dealing with disrespect. They get turned around, their equipment fails, they hear sounds in the caves that make them want to leave quickly. The Guardian doesn't have to hurt anyone anymore. It just has to make sure they understand that some places demand reverence. I'm 67 now. Been thinking about retirement, but when I mentioned it to the Guardian last month, it reminded me that our partnership isn't the kind of job you can just quit. These mountains have been sacred for over 800 years. The agreements between worlds don't end when one person gets tired. Besides, there are new threats now. Climate change is exposing cave systems that have been sealed for centuries. Urban development keeps creeping closer to sacred sites. And there's always someone who thinks they can get rich by stealing pieces of Cherokee heritage. So I keep walking the deep places. Keep listening to the mountain's voice. Keep protecting what needs protection. And when young rangers ask me about the Cherokee stories of creatures living in caves, I tell them the same thing I told Maria all those years ago. After enough time underground, you learn that the old stories usually get the important parts right. And if they're smart, they listen. My name is Jonathan Brightfeather, and I've been a park ranger at Seneca Rocks for 14 years. People call me John. I'm part of the Seneca Nation, and these mountains have been in my blood since birth. My grandmother used to tell me stories about these cliffs when I was little, stories I thought were just tales to keep kids from wandering too close to the edge. Seneca Rocks sits in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. It's a massive wall of white quartzite that shoots 900 feet straight up from the forest floor. Rock climbers come from all over the world to test themselves against these cliffs. My job is keeping them safe, teaching climbing courses, and running rescue operations when things go wrong. And things do go wrong. More than I'd like to admit. It was September 1991 when everything changed. The leaves were just starting to turn, and we were getting those early autumn storms that make climbing dangerous. High winds, sudden weather changes, loose rock from the freeze-thaw cycles. I'd been extra careful about checking conditions before letting climbers head up. I was 37 then, and I thought I'd seen everything these cliffs could throw at people. Broken bones from falls, hypothermia from sudden storms, equipment failures that left people stranded on ledges. I'd pulled more than 500 climbers off these rocks, some alive, some not. Each rescue taught me something new about staying alive in vertical terrain. But I'd never heard the screaming before. My partner that season was Lisa Redwing, another ranger with Seneca heritage. She was 10 years younger than me, but twice as tough. Lisa had grown up in these mountains too, and like me, she'd heard the old stories. Unlike me, she still believed some of them might be true. "Your grandmother ever tell you about the crying woman?" she asked me one evening in late August. We were sitting in the ranger station, going over incident reports from the week. 3 minor injuries, 1 equipment failure, nothing unusual. "Yeah," I said, not looking up from my paperwork. "Some ghost story about a woman who fell off the cliffs back in the 1800s. Supposed to warn people about danger. What if it's not just a story?" I looked at her then. Lisa wasn't the type to believe in fairy tales. She was practical, scientific, the kind of person who checked weather instruments twice before trusting them. "You've been talking to the old folks again," I said. "Maybe. But I've been thinking about the pattern of accidents we've had this year. 7 fatalities, all in different spots, all experienced climbers who should have known better." She was right about the numbers. We'd had a bad year for deaths, and it was troubling me too. But there are always explanations for climbing accidents, equipment failure, weather changes, human error. I didn't need ghost stories to explain why people die on vertical rock. The first time I heard the screaming, I thought it was just wind through the rock formations. These cliffs are full of cracks and caves that can make strange sounds when the air moves through them just right. It was 3 in the morning, and I was doing a routine security check of the base camping area. The sound started low, almost like moaning. Then it rose higher, becoming a wail that made my skin crawl. It sounded like a woman in terrible pain, crying out for help that would never come. I grabbed my flashlight and thermal imaging camera, standard equipment for night searches. If someone was hurt up on those cliffs, I needed to find them fast. But when I scanned the rock faces, the thermal showed nothing. No heat signatures, no sign of life anywhere on the vertical walls. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat and the normal sounds of the forest. Owls, small animals moving through the underbrush, wind in the trees. Everything was peaceful again. But something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. Even the insects had stopped making noise. I checked the climbing register to see who was camping in the area. 2 teams had signed in for multi-day climbs, both planning to sleep on ledges about 400 feet up. I radioed them on the emergency channel. Base to climbing teams Alpha and Bravo, requesting status check. Static. Then, Alpha here, all good. Why the check? Bravo team, all fine. Heard some weird sounds, thought maybe someone was in trouble. I didn't tell them I'd heard screaming. Rangers aren't supposed to spook the people they're protecting. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. At the base of the North Peak, exactly where the screaming had seemed to come from, there was a perfect circle of dead birds. 12 ravens, all lying with their wings spread, beaks pointing toward the cliff face. There was no sign of what had killed them. No wounds, no signs of disease. They just looked like they'd fallen out of the sky and died. Lisa found me staring at them when she arrived for her shift. "That's not normal," she said quietly. "No kidding. You ever see anything like this before?" She knelt down and examined one of the ravens without touching it. "My grandfather told me stories. When the spirits are restless, the birds are the first to know. They die rather than stay where death is coming." I wanted to dismiss it as coincidence. but the pattern bothered me. 12 birds, arranged in a perfect circle, all dead at the exact spot where I'd heard screaming that shouldn't exist. "We should report this to wildlife management," I said. "Sure, but John, what if this is connected to something else? What if the old stories are trying to tell us something important?" I looked up at the cliff face above us. 900 feet of white rock, beautiful and deadly. In 14 years of working these mountains, I'd learned to trust my instincts about danger. And right now, every instinct I had was screaming that something was very, very wrong. The second incident happened 3 days later. Tom Morrison, an experienced climber from Colorado, was attempting a solo ascent of Old Lady's Route, a challenging climb on the South Peak. He'd been climbing for 20 years and had permits for the most technical routes in the park. I was monitoring the weather that morning when the screaming started again. This time, it was louder, more desperate, and it was coming from the exact section of cliff where Morrison was climbing. I grabbed my radio and tried to reach him. Static. Then, finally, "Morrison here. Jesus Christ, Ranger, what was that sound? You heard it too?" Sounded like a woman screaming bloody murder. Came from right above me, but there's nobody up there. I can see the whole route. I set up my spotting scope and focused on his position. Morrison was about 300 feet up, moving carefully along a narrow ledge. Above him, the cliff face was empty. Nothing but white rock and morning shadows. "Morrison, can you see anything unusual? Any loose rock? Any signs of movement?" "Negative. But Ranger, I've got to tell you, something feels really wrong up here. My ropes keep catching on things that aren't there. And the rock? It's warm. Way warmer than it should be in this weather." I checked the temperature, 45 degrees, with a cold wind coming down from the peaks. The rock should have been ice cold. "Morrison, I'm recommending you abort the climb and return to base." Long pause. "Copy that, Ranger. This place is giving me the creeps." It took Morrison an hour to rappel down to safety. When he reached the bottom, his face was pale and he was shaking. "Ranger, I've been climbing for 2 decades, and I've never experienced anything like that. About halfway down, I could swear someone was climbing above me. I could hear breathing, gear clinking, all the sounds of another climber. But every time I looked up, there was nothing there." I examined his equipment. The rope showed unusual wear patterns, as if it had been rubbing against sharp edges that didn't exist. His carabiners were scratched, and one had somehow come partially unclipped despite being properly secured. "Did you feel anything else unusual?" Morrison thought for a moment. "Yeah. Right before I heard the screaming, I watched. Like someone was staring at me from behind. But when you're on a cliff face, there's nobody behind you except empty air." That afternoon, Lisa and I hiked up to the area where Morrison had been climbing. We found more dead birds, a scattered line of them leading up to the base of the cliff. But more disturbing were the rocks. Someone, or something, had arranged loose stones in a pattern at the bottom of the route. Not random scree from normal rockfall, but carefully placed rocks forming what looked like an arrow, pointing up toward the climbing route. "No way that's natural," Lisa said. I knelt down and examined the arrangement. The rocks were still warm, just like Morrison had described. In the middle of the arrow pattern, scratched into a flat piece of sandstone, was a symbol I recognized from my grandmother's stories. A spiral with 3 lines crossing through it. "That's a Seneca warning sign," I said. "It means danger from above." Lisa took photos while I tried to figure out how someone could have carved that symbol. The scratches were deep and precise, but there were no tool marks. Looked like it had been carved with fingernails. Human fingernails. That night, I called my grandmother. She was 87 and lived on the reservation about 2 hours north. I hadn't spoken to her about the old stories in years. "Grandmother, I need to ask you about the crying woman at Seneca Rocks." Silence on the other end. Then, "Jonathan, why are you asking about her now?" I told her everything. The screaming, the dead birds, Morrison's experience, the warning signs. She listened, without interrupting, making small sounds of understanding that told me she wasn't surprised by any of it. "Her name was Mary Cloud Walker," my grandmother said finally. "She was 19 years old when she fell. It was 1,847, and there were miners working in the area. A tunnel collapse trapped 3 men deep in the mountain. Mary was the best climber in our village. so she volunteered to go down and try to reach them through a crack in the cliff face. What happened? She found the men. They were still alive, but barely. She managed to get water and food to them, and she worked for 3 days trying to widen the crack so they could escape. On the third night, exhaustion made her careless. She fell. I felt cold despite the warm evening. Did the miners survive? No. Without Mary to bring them supplies, they died 2 days later. But before she fell, Mary had promised their families she would bring them home safe. The elders say her spirit couldn't rest because she broke that promise. She's been trying to keep people safe on those cliffs ever since. Grandmother, do you think she's really there? Another long pause. Jonathan, I think the spirits try to warn us when they can, but the living don't always listen to the dead. I hung up the phone feeling more unsettled than before. But I'm a man of science and training. I believe in weather patterns and equipment failures and human error. I don't believe in. The screaming started again at 2:17 a.m. This time I was ready. I had my thermal camera, night vision equipment, and recording devices. The sound was coming from the North Peak, loud and desperate and impossibly clear in the still air. Through the thermal camera, I saw her. A figure in white, clinging to the cliff face, about 600 feet up. Definitely human-shaped, but the heat signature was all wrong. Instead of the warm red and yellow of a living person, she glowed cold blue-white like ice. I switched to night vision and tried to get a clearer image. For just a moment, I saw her clearly. A young Native American woman in a long dress, her black hair streaming in a wind that wasn't affecting anything else. She was looking directly at me across the distance, and her mouth was open in that terrible scream. Then she pointed, down toward the base of the cliff, to a specific spot I couldn't see clearly from my position. The screaming stopped. The figure vanished. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and ran toward the area where she'd pointed. What I found there made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Carved into the rock at the base of the cliff, in letters 3 feet tall, were the words, "Don't climb tomorrow." The letters were fresh. They hadn't been there during my evening patrol, just 6 hours earlier. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my truck, staring at that message, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Vandals with climbing gear and portable carving tools? Possible, but who would risk their lives for a prank that elaborate? When Lisa arrived for the morning shift, I showed her the message. "We need to close the climbing areas," she said immediately. Based on what? A ghost story and some vandalism? Based on the fact that something is trying to warn people about danger. And if you don't believe in the supernatural explanation, then believe in the practical one. Someone with access to professional climbing equipment and rock carving tools is operating in our area at night. Either way, it's not safe. I wanted to argue with her, but I couldn't. Too many things didn't add up. Too many impossible details were piling up into a pattern I didn't want to acknowledge. At 8:30 a.m., a climbing team from Virginia checked in for a day climb on the North Peak. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all experienced, all properly equipped. I found myself staring at them as they filled out their permits, remembering the figure on the cliff pointing toward this exact area. "Folks," I heard myself saying, "I need to recommend you consider postponing your climb today. Weather conditions are uncertain." The team leader, a man in his 30s with professional-grade gear, looked at the clear blue sky. "Forecast looks perfect, Ranger. What's the problem?" I couldn't tell them I'd seen a ghost. I couldn't show them a message that might be vandalism. But every instinct I'd developed in 14 years of mountain rescue was screaming at me to keep these people off the cliffs. "Just a recommendation," I said finally. "Conditions can change fast up there." They thanked me politely and headed for the trailhead anyway. I spent the morning in a state of dread I couldn't explain, checking my radio every few minutes, scanning the cliff faces with binoculars. At 11:47 a.m., my worst fears came true. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Climbing Team Virginia requesting immediate rescue. We have a serious accident on North Peak, about 400 feet up. 1 climber down, unconscious, possible head trauma. Need medical evacuation now." The rescue took 4 hours. Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old software engineer from Richmond, had taken a 40-foot fall when her anchor point failed. By the time we got her off the cliff and to a helicopter landing zone, she was in a coma. She died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The accident investigation found nothing wrong with her equipment. The rock where her anchor had been placed showed no signs of structural failure. According to every technical analysis, what happened to Sarah Chen was impossible. But it had happened exactly 24 hours after the warning message appeared. Lisa didn't say, "I told you so," but I could see it in her eyes. And worse, I was starting to believe she'd been right. The next week brought 2 more incidents. A solo climber named Marcus Webb reported his rope being cut by something sharp while he was rappelling down from the south peak. When we examined the rope, we found clean cuts that looked like they'd been made by a knife, but Webb had been alone on the cliff, and the cuts were in sections of rope he couldn't have reached himself. 3 days later, climbing guide Jennifer Walsh called for emergency assistance when she found herself unable to descend from a ledge on the east face. Her route down had somehow changed. Handholds and footholds she'd used on the way up were no longer there. When I reached her position, I found the rock surface was smooth, where her climbing holds should have been, as if someone had filled in the cracks and crevices with liquid stone. Both incidents had been preceded by the screaming. I started keeping detailed records: times, locations, weather conditions, phases of the moon, anything that might help me understand what was happening. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency. The screaming always came at night, always from the section of cliff where an accident would occur within the next day or two. The sound lasted exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds each time, and it was always preceded by the death of birds in the immediate area. Lisa began having dreams. "I see her," she told me after the 3rd week. "The woman in white. She shows me things, climbers in trouble, accidents that haven't happened yet. Last night, I dreamed about a man with a red helmet falling from the chimney route. He had a scar on his left hand shaped like a crescent moon." "Lisa, you're under stress. We all are. It's been a bad season." "Then explain this." She pulled out her notebook and showed me detailed sketches of climbing routes, complete with technical notations about anchor points and hazard areas. "I drew these after my dreams. I've never climbed half these routes, and I don't know where this technical information came from. I studied the drawings. They were professionally accurate, showing details about rock structure and climbing challenges that Lisa couldn't have known without first-hand experience on those routes." "She's trying to help us," Lisa said. "Mary Cloud Walker is showing us where the danger is so we can prevent accidents." The next day, a climber named Dave Torino checked in for a solo climb. Red helmet, scar on his left hand in the shape of a crescent moon. He was planning to attempt the chimney route. I stared at his permit application, remembering Lisa's dream. "Sir, I need to ask you to reconsider your climbing plan today." Torino looked confused. "Why?" "Weather's perfect, and I've climbed this route a dozen times. We've had some unusual incidents lately. Equipment failures, rockfall, unstable conditions. Ranger, with all due respect, I can see the route from here. It looks fine." I couldn't legally prevent him from climbing based on a dream, no matter how accurate Lisa's previous visions had been. All I could do was make sure I was monitoring his progress carefully. At 2:15 p.m., exactly when Lisa had predicted, Torino's anchor failed. He fell 60 feet before his backup protection caught him. When I reached him, he was alive but badly injured: 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a concussion. "Ranger," he gasped as I stabilized him for evacuation. "Just before I fell, I could swear someone pushed me. But there was nobody there. Nobody at all." That night, the screaming was different. Louder, more urgent, and it seemed to be coming from multiple locations at once. Through my thermal camera, I saw not one figure but 3: Mary Cloud Walker and 2 others, all clinging to different sections of the cliff face. The new figures were men in mining clothes from the 1800s. I realized I was looking at the 3 miners Mary had died trying to save, now bound to the same duty that trapped her spirit. They were all pointing toward the base parking area, where a group of college students from West Virginia University had set up camp. 22 young people planning a group climb the next morning as part of an outdoor education class. The message carved in the rock the next morning was longer. "Many die tomorrow. Stop the climb." I showed the message to my supervisor, Park Superintendent Janet Rodriguez. She was a practical woman who'd worked in the national park system for 20 years. "John, I appreciate your concern about safety, but I can't shut down climbing operations based on vandalism. We have no evidence of actual danger." "Janet, We've had 4 serious accidents in 3 weeks, all preceded by warning signs. Accidents happen. That's why we have safety protocols and rescue teams. What if I told you I've been seeing things? Impossible things that predict these accidents with perfect accuracy? She looked at me with the kind of expression reserved for employees showing signs of stress breakdown. John, have you been getting enough sleep? Maybe you should take some time off. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't explain that the spirits of people who died 150 years ago were trying to prevent a mass casualty event through supernatural warnings that only Lisa and I seemed able to interpret. Instead, I made a decision that would either save lives or end my career. At 4 a.m., I submitted a false weather emergency report. Severe storm system moving in, high winds predicted, immediate evacuation of all climbing areas required. It was completely fabricated, but it would keep the college group off the cliffs. Janet called me at 5:30 a.m., furious. John, I've checked with the National Weather Service. There's no storm coming. Clear skies are forecast for the entire week. Sometimes local conditions develop faster than regional forecasts can track. Don't lie to me. Cancel the evacuation order now, or I'll have no choice but to suspend you. I looked out my window at the college students breaking camp, disappointed but compliant with the evacuation order. 22 young people who would live to see another day because I'd chosen to believe in ghosts rather than bureaucracy. I can't do that, Janet. Then you're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your radio and vehicle keys. An hour later, I was officially off duty, but I wasn't leaving those kids to die. I hiked up to the cliff base through an unmarked trail I'd used for years. If I couldn't prevent the disaster as a ranger, maybe I could prevent it as a civilian. At the very least, I could witness what the spirits had been trying to warn us about. At exactly 9:47 a.m., I heard the sound of cracking rock. A section of cliff, face the size of a small building, broke away from the main wall and crashed down onto the area where the college group would have been climbing. Tons of quartzite slammed into the rocks below with the force of a small earthquake. If those 22 students had been on the cliff that morning, they would all be dead. I sat in the dust and debris, listening to the echoes fade across the valley. When I looked up at the cliff face, I saw Mary Cloudwalker one more time. She was standing on a ledge that should have been impossible to reach, and for the first time since I'd been seeing her, she was smiling. Then she faded away like morning mist. My radio crackled. I'd forgotten to turn it in during the chaos of my suspension. John, this is Janet. I'm looking at a massive rockfall where those college kids were supposed to be climbing. How did you know? I keyed the microphone. Lucky guess. They reinstated me the next day. Janet didn't ask for details about how I'd known to evacuate the climbing areas, and I didn't volunteer them. Some things are better left as lucky guesses. But Mary Cloudwalker's work wasn't finished. Over the next month, the supernatural activity intensified. I saw her almost nightly now, sometimes accompanied by the 3 miners, sometimes appearing as a faint outline during daylight hours. She would point toward specific climbing routes, and Lisa would have dreams showing detailed visions of accidents that would occur there. We developed a system. When Lisa had a warning dream, I would find reasons to direct climbers away from those routes. Equipment inspections, wildlife surveys, temporary closures for geological monitoring. It worked most of the time. But we couldn't save everyone. On October 15th, experienced climber Rachel Martinez ignored my recommendation to avoid the direct route on North Peak. She was training for an expedition in Alaska and needed to practice on challenging terrain. Ranger, I appreciate your concern, but I know my limits. I'll be fine. The screaming that night was the loudest I'd ever heard, desperate and heartbroken. Through my thermal camera, I watched Mary Cloudwalker climb frantically up and down the cliff face, trying to reach the route where Martinez was planning to climb. At dawn, Martinez began her ascent. I monitored her progress through binoculars, dreading what I knew was coming but powerless to prevent it. At 11:30 a.m., Martinez radioed that she was having equipment problems. Her gear was behaving strangely, ropes twisting into knots by themselves, carabiners coming unclipped despite being properly secured. At 11:45 a.m., she screamed. It took me 20 minutes to reach her position with climbing gear. I found Martinez hanging from her safety line, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound. Above her, carved into the rock face in letters I could read even from my position below, were the words. "I'm sorry." Martinez survived, but barely. In the hospital, she told me about her final moments of consciousness. Just before I fell, I saw her. A young woman, in an old-fashioned dress, reaching out like she was trying to catch me. She looked so sad, Ranger, like she'd been crying for 100 years. That night, Mary appeared to me not as a distant figure on the cliff, but standing directly in front of my truck. For the first time, I could see her clearly. She was beautiful and young, maybe 19, with traditional Seneca clothing and long black hair that moved in a wind I couldn't feel. But her eyes were ancient, filled with a grief that seemed to encompass all the deaths she'd witnessed over the past 150 years. She spoke, and I heard her voice as clearly as if she were alive. "I've tried for so long to save them, but I'm not strong enough anymore. Each time I fail to prevent a death, I become weaker. Soon I won't be able to warn anyone." "What do you need?" I asked. "Someone to take my place. Someone who can do what I cannot, actually prevent the deaths instead of just warning about them." I understood. The spirits could see danger coming, but they couldn't physically intervene. They needed a living person who could act on their warnings. "There's a cost," Mary continued. "If you accept this responsibility, you'll see death approaching every person who enters these mountains. You'll know when and how they'll die, but you'll only be able to save them if they listen to warnings from a living ranger instead of a dead woman. And if they don't listen, then you'll watch them die, knowing you could have prevented it. That knowledge will stay with you for the rest of your life." I thought about all the climbers I'd rescued over the years, all the accidents I'd prevented through training and preparation, and being in the right place at the right time. How many more could I save if I could see death coming before it arrived? "What happened to the 3 miners you died trying to save?" Mary's expression grew even sadder. "They chose to stay with me rather than move on to whatever comes after death. They felt responsible for my sacrifice. We're all bound here until we can fulfill the duty I accepted, keeping people safe on these cliffs. If I do this, will you be free?" "Yes, all of us. But John, you need to understand, this gift comes with a terrible burden. You'll spend the rest of your life carrying the weight of deaths you couldn't prevent, and you'll never be able to tell anyone the real reason you know what you know." I looked up at the cliffs, thinking about all the people who came here seeking adventure and challenge, unaware of the supernatural guardians trying to protect them. "I accept." Mary smiled for the second time since I'd been seeing her. She reached out as if to touch my face, and I felt a coldness pass through me that went deeper than physical sensation. It was the chill of centuries, the accumulated grief of every life lost on these cliffs, the weight of responsibility for protecting everyone who would ever climb here. Then she was gone. But I wasn't alone. Standing behind me were Lisa and my grandmother, who had driven down from the reservation without telling me she was coming. "Your grandmother called and told me what was happening," Lisa said. "We've been watching from the parking area. Did you see her?" My grandmother nodded. "Mary Cloud Walker can rest now. But grandson, you've accepted a heavy burden. Someone has to carry it." "Yes, and now someone will. But you won't carry it alone." Lisa stepped forward. "I've been having the dreams for weeks. I think the spirits have been preparing me to help you." Over the following days, I discovered the extent of my new abilities. When climbers entered the park, I could see a faint aura around those who were in danger, a dark shadow that intensified as the time of their accident approached. I could sense which routes were unstable, which equipment would fail, which weather changes would trap people on exposed ledges. Most importantly, as a living ranger with official authority, I could close routes, require equipment inspections, and order evacuations in ways the spirits never could. The first life I saved was a solo climber named Kevin Park, who arrived with plans to attempt a dangerous winter ascent. The shadow around him was so dark it looked like he was already dead. I required him to climb with a partner and mandated specific safety equipment that prevented the rockfall accident that would have killed him. The second was a family group whose youngest member, a 12-year-old girl, was going to slip on wet rock and fall to her death. I closed that section of cliff for routine maintenance until conditions improved. By November, word was spreading among the climbing community that the rangers at Seneca Rocks had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict and prevent accidents. Our safety record became the best in the region, But the burden was exactly what Mary had warned me about. I knew which climbers would die if they didn't listen to my warnings, and I had to watch some of them ignore my advice and proceed to their deaths anyway. Each preventable fatality felt like a personal failure, even when I'd done everything possible to warn them. The worst was James Sullivan, an arrogant climber who refused to postpone his ascent despite my insistence that conditions were dangerous. He died exactly as I'd seen he would, falling from the same route where Mary Cloudwalker had tried to save the miners 150 years earlier. That was 34 years ago. I'm 71 now, and I've been carrying Mary's burden for most of my adult life. In that time, I've prevented over 300 climbing deaths and watched 17 people die who wouldn't listen to warnings that couldn't be fully explained. Lisa became my full partner in this work, and eventually my wife. Her dreams evolved into a gift for sensing which specific routes and conditions would be dangerous, complementing my ability to see death approaching individual climbers. Together, we've made Seneca Rocks one of the safest climbing areas in North America. My grandmother passed away in 2003. But before she died, she taught me the traditional ceremonies for honoring Mary Cloudwalker and the 3 miners. Every October 15th, the anniversary of Mary's death, we hold a remembrance ceremony at the base of the cliffs. The climbing community has adopted it as an annual safety awareness event, never knowing they're actually honoring the spirits who've been protecting them for generations. The supernatural activity at Seneca Rocks mostly ended when I accepted Mary's burden, but not completely. Sometimes, during particularly dangerous conditions, I still see her on the cliffs, no longer trapped and desperate, but watching peacefully as Lisa and I do the work she can no longer perform. New rangers come and go, and we train them in the safety protocols and intuitive awareness that help prevent accidents. We can't pass on the supernatural aspects of our knowledge, but we can teach them to trust their instincts about danger and to never ignore warning signs that might seem irrational. Some of them develop their own sensitivity to the spiritual aspects of these mountains. Park Ranger Maria Santos, who joined our team 5 years ago, has begun having dreams about equipment failures before they occur. We're watching to see if she might be called to carry on this work when Lisa and I can no longer do it. The official explanation for our exceptional safety record is advanced training, improved equipment standards, and rigorous weather monitoring. The Park Service has used Seneca Rocks as a model for climbing safety programs throughout the national park system. But those of us who know the truth understand that our success comes from honoring the spirits who've been protecting this place since 1847 and from accepting the responsibility to bridge the gap between the supernatural warning system and the practical needs of living climbers. If you ever visit Seneca Rocks, pay attention to the ranger recommendations. We have reasons for our safety protocols that go deeper than weather reports and equipment standards. And if you hear crying on the wind, especially at night, don't dismiss it as imagination. Mary Cloudwalker kept her vigil for 150 years, trying to save lives she couldn't physically protect. Now she can rest, but her duty continues through those of us who accepted the burden of seeing death, approaching and doing everything possible to turn it away. Some responsibilities transcend death. Some promises are too important to break, even when keeping them requires a lifetime of carrying other people's pain. I've watched thousands of climbers test themselves against these ancient cliffs, and I've learned that the mountains don't care about human ambition or skill or courage. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, the spirits of those who died protecting others will care enough to warn you away from dangers you can't see. Listen to them. Listen to the rangers who carry their burden. Your life might depend on it. My name is Maria Shadowhawk, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwater Falls for 15 years. People always ask about my last name, and I tell them it comes from my Cherokee grandmother. She used to say our family could see things that others couldn't. I never believed her until I started working here. Blackwater Falls is one of the most beautiful places in West Virginia. The waterfall drops 57 feet into a misty pool below. Ancient hemlock trees surround it like green guardians. On foggy days, the whole place looks like something from a fairy tale. That's why so many people come here to take pictures. I'm not just any ranger. I'm also a professional photographer. I know cameras inside and out. I've taken thousands of pictures of these falls in every season, every kind of weather. My photos have been in magazines and tourist books. I know what normal pictures look like. That's why what happened in November 1987 scared me so much. It started on a gray Tuesday afternoon. The air was cold and thick with fog. I was doing my usual safety check when I met Dave Peterson, a visitor from Ohio. He had expensive camera equipment and looked excited to photograph the falls. "This place is amazing," he said, adjusting his camera lens. "I've been taking pictures all morning." "Get some good shots?" I asked. He frowned. "Well, that's the weird thing. I thought I did, but when I look at them..." He showed me his camera's small screen. "See this one? I swear there was nobody else around when I took it." I looked at the picture. It showed the waterfall with its usual white spray and dark rocks. But in the mist, there was a dark shape that looked almost like a person. It was blurry, but definitely there. "Probably just a shadow from the trees," I said. But something cold moved through my stomach. "Or maybe another visitor you didn't notice." "Maybe," Dave said, but he didn't sound sure. "I've been doing photography for 20 years. I usually notice when people are in my shots." After Dave left, I couldn't stop thinking about that picture. I decided to take some photos myself. I knew every inch of these falls, every rock, every tree. If something was off, I'd spot it. I set up my professional camera on its tripod and started shooting. The afternoon light was perfect, cutting through the mist and silver beams. I took maybe 30 pictures from different angles. Everything seemed normal. But when I got back to the ranger station and developed the film, my hands started shaking. In 7 of the pictures, there were dark figures. Not blurry shadows this time. Clear, human-shaped forms standing in impossible places. One was on a rock in the middle of the waterfall's spray. Another seemed to be floating in the mist itself. They weren't visitors. I would have seen them. I called my partner, David Stormcloud. David was Cherokee too, from my grandmother's tribe. If anyone would believe what I was seeing, it would be him. "You need to come look at these photos," I told him over the radio. When David arrived, I spread the pictures on my desk. He studied them for a long time without saying anything. "Maria," he finally said, "these look like the shadow people." "The what?" "My grandfather told me about them. Spirits that got trapped between worlds. They show up in photographs, but you can't see them with your eyes." He pointed to one of the figures. "Look at this one. See how it has no shadow of its own?" I looked closer. He was right. Everything else in the picture cast shadows from the afternoon sun. But the dark figure stood there without casting any shadow at all. "That's impossible," I said. "Is it?" David asked. "Your grandmother never told you about the shadow walkers?" She had, but I'd always thought they were just stories, like the ones about monsters under the bed. Now, looking at these photographs, I wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figures in my pictures. Were they really there? If so, what did they want? The next morning, I got my answer. 3 days after I took those first photos, a woman named Sarah Mills came to the ranger station. She was pale and shaky, like she hadn't slept in days. "I need help," she said. "Something happened to my husband." I got her a cup of coffee and asked her to start from the beginning. "We came here last weekend to take pictures," Sarah explained. "Tom is really into photography. He brought all his best equipment." She pulled out a digital camera with trembling hands. We spent hours at the falls. Tom was so excited. He kept saying he was getting the best shots of his life. "Where is Tom now?" I asked. "That's the problem. He won't leave our hotel room. He just sits there, staring at these pictures. He won't eat, won't talk to me. He just keeps saying, 'They're calling me back.'" Sarah showed me the camera's screen. I felt that same cold feeling in my stomach. The pictures were full of shadow figures, dozens of them. They were clearer than the ones I'd seen before, almost solid-looking. "Has Tom ever acted like this before?" I asked. "Never. He's always been so energetic, so happy, but since we got back from the falls..." She started crying. "I think he's having a breakdown." I told Sarah I'd look into it and send her back to her hotel. Then I called David. "We've got a problem," I said. David and I went to the falls that afternoon. We brought a different camera, one I'd never used near the waterfall before. I wanted to see if the strange figures would still appear. The place felt different somehow. The air was colder, even though it was a warm day. The mist seemed thicker, and there was a sound, like whispering, just at the edge of hearing. "You feel that?" David asked. I nodded. It felt like we were being watched. I took one picture, just one. When I looked at it on the camera screen, my blood went cold. The photo was full of shadow figures, more than I'd ever seen before. They were gathered around the base of the waterfall like they were having some kind of meeting, and they were all looking straight at the camera, straight at us. "David," I whispered, "look at this." He looked at the screen and his face went white. "Maria, we need to leave. Now." But as we turned to go, I saw something that made me freeze. David's shadow on the ground was moving wrong. It should have been copying his movements, but it was moving a second too late, like it was fighting him. "David, don't move," I said. "What? Why?" "Look at your shadow." He looked down and gasped. His shadow had turned to look at us, even though David was still facing forward. For a moment, the shadow seemed to wave at us with one dark hand. Then it snapped back to normal, copying David's movements like shadows are supposed to do. We ran back to the ranger station without saying a word. That night, I called my grandmother. She was 85 and lived in North Carolina, but her mind was still sharp. "Grandmother," I said, "tell me about the shadow people." There was a long pause. "Why do you ask, child?" I told her everything. The photographs, the strange figures, David's shadow acting wrong. She listened without interrupting. "You're in great danger," she said finally. "The shadow people aren't just spirits. They're souls that got trapped by their own desire to capture images. They collect pieces of other souls through photographs." "What do you mean?" "Every time someone takes a picture near their hunting ground, they steal a small piece of that person's spirit. The more pictures you take, the more they steal. Eventually, they take so much that you become one of them." I thought about Tom Mills, sitting in his hotel room, staring at his pictures and refusing to eat. "How do I stop them?" I asked. "Find what's keeping them trapped. Destroy it. But be careful, Maria. They'll fight to protect their prison, and once they know you're trying to help their victims, they'll come for you." I hung up the phone with shaking hands. Outside my window, the fog was rolling in from the falls. In the dim light, I could swear I saw dark shapes moving through the mist. The shadow people knew I was watching them, and now they were watching me back. The next morning, I went to the local library to research the history of Blackwater Falls. If my grandmother was right about the shadow people being trapped souls, maybe I could find out who they used to be. What I found made everything worse. In 1889, a famous photographer named Edmund Blackthorne came to West Virginia. He was part of a movement called spirit photography, people who claimed they could take pictures of ghosts and demons. Most of them were fakes, but Blackthorne was different. He truly believed he could capture souls on film. Blackthorne set up camp at Blackwater Falls with 5 assistants. They spent months there, taking hundreds of photographs. According to newspaper reports, Blackthorne became obsessed with the idea that the mist around the falls contained trapped spirits. The newspaper story ended badly. In November 1889, all 6 men disappeared. Search parties found their equipment scattered around the falls, but never found the men themselves. The only clue was their final photographs, which showed dark figures that hadn't been visible when the pictures were taken. Sound familiar? I drove back to the ranger station, feeling sick. 6 photographers had vanished at the falls over 100 years ago. Now visitors were taking pictures and having mental breakdowns. Tom Mills was getting worse. His wife had called that morning to say he wouldn't even speak anymore. I had to do something, but what? How do you fight something that lives in photographs? I decided to try an experiment. I took one of my old cameras and loaded it with fresh film. Then I went to the falls, but this time I brought something special. A small mirror my grandmother had given me years ago. She'd said it was blessed by Cherokee medicine men to protect against evil spirits. The waterfall was busier than usual. A group of tourists had arrived with expensive cameras. They were laughing and posing for pictures, not knowing what danger they were in. "Excuse me," I called to them. "You might want to be careful taking pictures here." A man with a beard laughed. "Careful? It's just a waterfall, lady." I watched helplessly as they spent the next hour taking dozens of photos. Every time a camera clicked, I felt something cold brush against my skin. The mist around the falls seemed to get thicker. When the tourists finally left, I set up my own camera. I placed the blessed mirror on the ground next to my tripod and took a single photo. The result was terrifying. The picture showed at least 20 shadow figures surrounding the tourists as they took their photos. The dark shapes were reaching out with their hands, like they were trying to touch the people. But in the spots where my grandmother's mirror had reflected light, there were no shadows at all. The blessed mirror was keeping them away. I had proof that the shadow people were real. I had a way to protect people, but I still didn't know how to stop them permanently. That's when I heard the screaming. One of the tourists, a young woman, was running back toward the falls. She was crying and pointing at her camera. "It won't stop," she yelled. "The pictures won't stop changing." I looked at her camera screen. The photo she'd taken of her friends was shifting and moving like a tiny movie. The shadow figures in the background were getting clearer and clearer, and her friends in the picture, they were getting paler, more transparent. "Turn it off," I said. "I can't. Nothing works." The camera was ice cold in my hands. The screen showed the shadow people stepping forward in the photograph, reaching toward her friends. As they did, I could see her friends getting weaker and more ghost-like. I smashed the camera against a rock. The screen went black, and the terrible images stopped. The woman collapsed, sobbing. "What were those things?" "Old spirits," I said. "They're feeding off your photographs." I helped her back to her car and made her promise to warn her friends. Then I went back to the ranger station and called David. "It's getting worse," I told him. "They're getting stronger. I think they're getting ready to do something big." "Like what?" "I don't know, but we need to find Edmund Blackthorne's camera equipment. If my grandmother is right, destroying what trapped them here might set them free. And if it doesn't?" I looked out my window at the falls, where the mist was swirling in patterns that looked almost like faces. Then, we're all in trouble. Finding Edmund Blackthorne's equipment took 3 days of searching through old caves and hidden spots around the falls. David and I finally found it in a deep cave behind the waterfall itself. The passage was so narrow we had to crawl on our hands and knees. Inside the cave was a photographer's nightmare. Ancient cameras sat on rotting tripods. Glass plates covered in strange chemical stains were scattered everywhere. And in the center of it all was Blackthorne's main camera, a huge, old-fashioned thing with brass fittings and a black cloth hood. But the camera wasn't empty. It was humming with energy, and strange lights flickered inside its lens. "This is it," I whispered. "This is what's keeping them trapped." David shined his flashlight around the cave. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing the shadow people in various stages of becoming more and more solid. In the oldest pictures, they were just wisps of smoke. In the newest ones, they looked almost human. "Maria," David said, his voice tight with fear. "Look at this." He was pointing at a photograph near the camera. It showed Tom Mills sitting in his hotel room, staring at his camera. But in the picture, Tom was transparent, like a ghost. And standing behind him was a shadow figure that looked almost solid. "They're stealing his soul," I said, just like my grandmother warned. As if they'd heard me, the photographs on the cave walls started to move. The shadow people in the pictures turned to look at us. Their faces were becoming clearer, more human. I could see Edmund Blackthorne himself in one of them, his eyes wild with madness. The temperature in the cave dropped so fast I could see my breath. Ice started forming on the walls. "We need to destroy that camera," I said. But as I stepped toward it, the shadow people began climbing out of their photographs. They poured from the pictures like smoke, but once they were free, they became solid. I could see their faces. Now, 6 men from the 1800s, wearing old-fashioned clothes and carrying antique camera equipment. Edmund Blackthorne stood in front of them, his eyes glowing with unnatural light. "You cannot destroy our work," Blackthorne said. His voice echoed strangely, like it was coming from far away. "We have spent over a century collecting souls through photographs. Soon we will have enough to return to the living world." "You're stealing people's lives," I said. "We are preserving them," Blackthorne replied. "Each soul we capture lives forever in our photographs. Isn't that what all photographers want? To make moments last forever?" The other shadow figures spread out around the cave, blocking our escape. I pulled out my grandmother's mirror and held it up. Where its reflection touched them, the shadows writhed and pulled back. Cherokee magic, Blackthorn hissed. Your ancestors always meddled in things they didn't understand. I understand enough, I said. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a bundle of sage that my grandmother had sent me. I understand that you're not preserving anything, you're destroying it. I lit the sage with my lighter. The smoke filled the cave, and the shadow figures screamed. They began to fade, but not disappear. Clever, Blackthorn said, but not enough. He pointed his antique camera at me and David. There was a flash of impossible light, and I felt something being pulled out of my chest. It was like having my breath taken away, but worse. I could feel part of my soul being drawn into the camera. David collapsed next to me, gasping for air. Can't breathe. I realized what I had to do. Still holding my grandmother's mirror, I stumbled toward Blackthorn's camera. The other shadow figures tried to stop me, but the sage smoke and the blessed mirror kept them at bay. If you destroy the camera, you'll release a century of stored souls, Blackthorn warned. The energy will destroy you. Maybe, I said, but it'll free everyone you've trapped. I raised my grandmother's mirror above the camera. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in its brass surface, but I also saw all the souls that had been trapped inside. Tom Mills was there, and Sarah, and hundreds of other visitors over the years. They were all looking at me with hope in their eyes. Please, Tom's soul whispered from inside the camera, set us free. I brought the mirror down as hard as I could. The camera exploded with light and sound. The cave shook like an earthquake. The shadow figures screamed as they were pulled back into whatever realm they'd escaped from. And I felt a rush of souls flowing out of the broken camera, finally free to move on to whatever came next. The last thing I saw before I passed out was Edmund Blackthorn's face, twisted with rage and defeat as he faded into nothingness. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. David was sitting next to my bed, looking tired, but alive. How do you feel? He asked. Like I got hit by a truck, I said. But alive. What happened after the camera broke? Biggest electrical storm anyone's ever seen at the falls. Lightning hit the cave and sealed it shut. Parks closed for repairs. He smiled. Tom Mills called yesterday. He's completely back to normal. Doesn't remember anything about the photographs. And the other visitors? All fine. Whatever was affecting them, it's gone now. I spent a week recovering in the hospital. When I finally went back to work, Blackwater Falls felt different. The mist was normal mist. The air was warm and welcoming. When I took photographs, they showed exactly what I could see with my eyes. But I wasn't quite the same either. Sometimes, when I look through my camera viewfinder, I can see things that others can't. Not shadow people, those are gone for good. But sometimes I see lost hikers before they're officially missing, or I spot dangerous rock slides before they happen. My grandmother says the experience opened my spiritual sight. I use this gift to help people. I've prevented 3 accidents and found 2 missing children just by seeing things others couldn't see through my camera lens. The cave behind the waterfall never reopened. The Park Service decided it was too dangerous after the rock slide. Sometimes tourists ask me about the legends of the shadow people, and I tell them they're just old stories. But I keep my grandmother's mirror in my camera bag, just in case. 6 months after the incident, I got a letter from the Cherokee Nation. They wanted to make Blackwater Falls an official protected spiritual site. I helped them set up blessing ceremonies to make sure nothing like the shadow people could ever take hold here again. Now, when visitors come to take pictures of the beautiful waterfall, they go home with exactly what they came for: memories of a lovely day in nature. Their photographs show waterfalls and trees and smiling faces, nothing more. And that's exactly how it should be. But if you're ever at Blackwater Falls and your camera starts acting strange, or if you see dark shapes in your photos that weren't there when you took them, don't ignore it. Come find me. I'm Maria Shadowhawk, and I know how to deal with things that live in photographs. Because sometimes, the camera really does capture more than you bargained for. Asterisk. The end, asterisk, 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 author's note. Asterisk, asterisk. This story is based on the real Blackwater Falls State Park in West Virginia, though all supernatural events are fictional. The park is a beautiful and safe place to visit and take photographs. No actual shadow people were harmed in the making of this story. My name is Peter Nightfall, and I've spent 20 years watching the darkness on Mount Pleasant. Most folks think that's a strange way to make a living, but someone has to keep track of what moves through these Virginia mountains when the sun goes down. I'm a night ranger for Jefferson National Forest, and I know every sound these woods make after dark. People always ask me how I got into this line of work. The truth is, I never planned on it. I used to work radar for the Air Force, watching blips on screens, tracking everything that flew through our airspace. I was good at it too. Could tell you what kind of aircraft was coming from 50 miles away, just by how it moved on the scope. When I got out of the service, I figured I'd use those same skills to study wildlife instead of warplanes. Mount Pleasant sits about 4,000 feet up, with communication towers scattered across the peak like metal trees. It's isolated up here. The nearest town is 30 miles down winding roads that'll shake your truck apart if you're not careful. During the day, you might see a few hikers or the tech guys checking the radio equipment, but at night, it's just me, my partner Carol Windwright, and whatever's moving through the darkness. I love this work, don't get me wrong. There's something peaceful about being up here under all those stars, knowing you're the only human for miles around. I've tracked deer herds, monitored bear movements, counted owl populations. After 15,000 hours of night duty, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. That changed in August of 1976. It started with the animals acting strange. I'd been up here long enough to know their patterns, when the raccoons come out to hunt, where the deer like to graze, which trees the owls prefer for nesting. But that August, everything was off. The nocturnal animals that should have been active were nowhere to be found. The woods were too quiet, like nature was holding its breath. Carol noticed it too. She'd been working these mountains almost as long as I had, and she could read animal behavior like a book. Something's got them spooked, she told me one night as we sat in the observation tower, scanning the forest with our binoculars. I haven't seen a single bat in 3 nights. That's not normal. I trusted Carol's instincts. She grew up in these mountains, knew the old Cherokee stories about things that lived in the deep woods. Her grandmother used to tell her about the flying man, something with red eyes that showed up before bad things happened. I always figured it was just local folklore, the kind of stories mountain people tell to keep kids from wandering off at night. But then the electronics started acting up. It began with small things. Radios picking up signals from empty frequencies, infrared sensors detecting heat signatures that vanished before we could track them. I'd check and recheck the equipment, but everything seemed to be working fine. The problems only happened at night, and only when we were monitoring certain areas of the mountain. One clear evening, I was calibrating the radar equipment we used to track migrating bird flocks. The screen showed something moving at about 2,000 feet, which wasn't unusual. Birds flew over the mountain all the time. But this contact was different. It was too big for a bird, too fast for a helicopter. The radar showed something with a 15-foot wingspan moving at speeds that should have been impossible for anything that size. I called Carol over to look at the screen. "What do you make of this?" She studied the blip for a few seconds, watching it make a perfect 90-degree turn without losing speed or altitude. "That's not a bird," she said quietly. "And it's not a plane either." We tracked the object for 10 minutes before it disappeared completely, not flying away, just vanishing from the screen like someone had turned off a switch. I ran diagnostics on the radar system 3 times. Everything checked out perfect. That was the first time I seriously considered that something strange was happening up here. But I'm a practical man, trained to look for logical explanations. Equipment malfunctions happen. Birds can move in unexpected ways. There had to be a reasonable answer. I just hadn't found it yet. The real trouble started 2 days later. Carol and I were doing our regular patrol around midnight when we heard the first scream. It wasn't an animal sound. I know every noise the local wildlife makes, from the screech of an angry bobcat to the howl of coyotes calling to their pack. This was something else entirely. A sound that seemed to come from directly overhead, but also from everywhere at once. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then cut off like someone had slammed a door. "Did you hear that?" Carol whispered. I nodded, already reaching for my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty trees and the glint of the communication towers in the distance. But something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier, like the pressure you feel before a thunderstorm. My radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, this is base. "We're getting reports of a disturbance in your area. Everything okay up there?" I keyed the microphone. "Unit 47 here. We heard something, but we're investigating. We'll report back in 10 minutes. What we found still gives me nightmares." About 50 yards from the main trail, Carol's flashlight beam caught something that shouldn't have been there. Footprints. But not from any animal I'd ever seen. They were huge, at least 18 inches long, and showed clear claw marks pressed deep into the rocky ground. Whatever made them had to weigh several hundred pounds. "Peter," Carol called softly. "Look at this." She was shining her light up into the trees above the prints. Branches were broken at a height of about 12 feet, snapped clean off as if something large had crashed through them. But the strange part was the pattern. The damage went straight up for 30 feet before stopping completely. Whatever had caused it hadn't climbed the tree. It had gone straight up through the branches, and then, what? Flown away? I took pictures of everything with the camera we used for wildlife documentation, though I wasn't sure anyone would believe what we'd found. The prints were unlike anything in our field guides. Too big for a bear, wrong shape for a mountain lion. The claw marks were too deep and too far apart. "We need to call this in," I said. But when I tried to use the radio, all I got was static. The communication towers were less than a mile away, and our equipment was military grade. There was no reason we shouldn't have been able to reach base. That's when we saw the eyes. They appeared about 40 feet away, hovering about 10 feet off the ground. Two red dots glowing like cigarette ends in the darkness, too far apart to belong to any normal animal. They just hung there, watching us, unblinking. I raised my flashlight toward them, but the beam seemed to die before it reached whatever was carrying those eyes. The light just faded into the darkness like it was being absorbed. "Don't move," Carol breathed beside me. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. We stood frozen while those red eyes observed us. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel sweat running down my back despite the cool mountain air. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but my Air Force training kept me steady. Never turn your back on an unknown contact. Then the eyes blinked once and vanished. The silence that followed was complete. No insects, no night birds, no wind through the trees. Even our breathing seemed too loud. I kept my flashlight aimed at the spot where the eyes had been, but there was nothing there now except empty darkness. "What was that?" Carol whispered. "I don't know." But that wasn't entirely true. Deep down, in a part of my mind that I usually kept locked away, I was starting to remember the stories Carol's grandmother had told. The flying man with red eyes, the warnings about death omens. We finished our patrol in silence, both of us jumping at every shadow. When we finally made it back to the observation station, our radio equipment was working normally again. I filed a routine report about the broken branches and unusual tracks, but I didn't mention the eyes. Who would believe that? I didn't sleep well for the next 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red dots hovering in the darkness, watching me with an intelligence that felt ancient and terrible. Carol started having dreams. She told me about them over coffee before our next shift. Dreams where she could fly over the mountain, seeing everything spread out below her like a map. In the dreams, she watched cars driving along, the interstate 20 miles away, saw their headlights following the curves of the highway. "The weird part," she said, "is that I wake up knowing things. Like yesterday, I knew that blue sedan would have engine trouble before it happened. I watched the driver pull over to the side of the road, saw him get out and look under the hood. Then I woke up and heard about it on the traffic report. I didn't know what to say to that. Carol was one of the most level-headed people I'd ever worked with. If she said she was having prophetic dreams, I believed her. But that didn't mean I understood what was happening to her, or to me, for that matter, because I was starting to notice things too, little things at first. A feeling that I should check a particular section of fence line, only to find it damaged. An urge to call the fire department about a small blaze that they hadn't discovered yet. Nothing I could point to as proof of anything supernatural, but too many coincidences to ignore. Then came the night that changed everything. August 23rd, 1976. I remember the date because it was the night I stopped being a skeptic. Carol and I were monitoring the radio equipment when every piece of electronic gear on the mountain started going crazy at once. Radar screens filled with false contacts. Radio receivers picked up what sounded like voices speaking in languages that didn't exist, and the magnetic compasses spun like pinwheels. "It's here," Carol said, and I knew she was right. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the metal surfaces around us. In August, in Virginia, at 4,000 feet elevation, that was impossible, but it was happening anyway. Then we heard the wings. It sounded like a helicopter at first, that deep whump-whump of air being displaced by something large. But helicopters don't fly without lights, and helicopters don't hover completely silent between wing beats. This was something else entirely. I grabbed the spotlight we used for emergency signaling and aimed it toward the sound. What I saw in that beam of light still wakes me up some nights. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with wings that stretched 15 feet from tip to tip. The body looked almost human, but covered in gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The head was wrong, too large and the wrong shape, with those burning red eyes that I'd seen before. But the most unsettling thing was how it moved. This creature, this thing that shouldn't exist, flew with a grace that made birds look clumsy. It could stop in midair, change direction without warning, hover motionless for minutes at a time. The wings moved slowly, almost lazily, like it was swimming through the air rather than flying through it, and it was looking right at us. "Turn off the light," Carol whispered. "Why?" "Because it's trying to tell us something." I thought she'd lost her mind, but I switched off the spotlight anyway. In the darkness that followed, I heard something that made my blood turn cold. The creature was making sounds, not the screams we'd heard before, but something rhythmic and deliberate. Morse code. I'd learned Morse code in the Air Force, and this pattern was unmistakable. 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Then a pause, followed by more code that I struggled to translate in my head. "Danger," I whispered to Carol as I worked out the message. "Steelbird falls. Many die. Dawn." The transmission repeated 3 times, then stopped. When I turned the spotlight back on, the creature was gone. "Steelbird," Carol said. "That means airplane." I checked my watch. It was 3:30 a.m. Dawn was 3 hours away. "We have to warn someone," Carol said. "If there's going to be a plane crash." "Warn them about what?" I interrupted. "That a giant flying monster told us in Morse code that a plane's going to crash? They'll lock us up." But Carol was already reaching for the radio. She called the regional airport, the FAA, even the state police. She told them we'd picked up a distress signal, that there might be an aircraft in trouble. She didn't mention how we'd received the message. At 6:47 a.m., a commuter flight from Charleston to Richmond went down in the mountains 15 miles east of our position. Engine failure. 12 people died. Carol didn't talk to me for the rest of our shift. When our replacement team arrived at dawn, she got in her truck and drove away without saying goodbye. I didn't see her again for 3 days. When she finally came back to work, she looked like she'd aged 10 years. "We could have saved them," she said. "How? By telling people a monster warned us? They would have grounded us, not the plane." There had to be a way. Maybe she was right. Maybe we could have found some believable explanation that would have kept that plane on the ground. But we didn't. And 12 people were dead because we couldn't figure out how to deliver a warning that anyone would take seriously. That's when I realized what we were dealing with. This wasn't just some unknown species of animal. This was something that could see the future, something that was trying to prevent disasters. And for some reason, it had chosen us as its messengers. The question was, what were we going to do about it? Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself 4 more times. The creature would appear, deliver warnings in Morse code about accidents that hadn't happened yet, then vanish before we could get a good look at it. A bridge collapse on Highway 220. A chemical spill at a plant in Roanoke. A house fire that would trap a family of 5. Each time, Carol tried to call in warnings, using whatever excuse she could think of to get authorities to check on potential problems. Sometimes it worked. The bridge got inspected and closed just hours before a section collapsed. Sometimes it didn't. The chemical plant ignored our anonymous tip about a potential leak. But people were starting to notice that we seemed to have an unusual talent for predicting disasters. Questions were being asked. Reports were being filed. And somewhere in a government office, Someone was connecting dots that we didn't want connected. That's when the military showed up. They came at dawn on a Tuesday, 3 black SUVs driving up the mountain road like they owned it. Men in suits with serious expressions and credentials that made local law enforcement step aside without asking questions. "Mr. Nightfall," the lead agent said when they found me at the observation station. "I'm Colonel Matthews, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to talk." They knew everything. About the radar contacts, the electromagnetic anomalies, the accurate predictions. They had recordings of Carol's calls to various agencies, photographs of the footprints we'd found, even video footage from security cameras that had somehow captured brief glimpses of something large flying over nearby towns. "What is it?" Colonel Matthews asked, spreading photos across the table. "And don't tell me you don't know. You've had more contact with this thing than anyone else." I looked at the images, dark shapes against night skies, blurred and indistinct but clearly showing something with wings that was far too large to be a bird. In one photo, taken from a traffic camera, you could just make out 2 glowing red dots where the eyes should be. "I don't know what it is," I said, which was the truth. "But I know what it does." I told them about the warnings, about the disasters that had been prevented or couldn't be prevented. I explained how the creature seemed to know about accidents before they happened, how it was trying to save lives in the only way it could. Colonel Matthews listened without interrupting, taking notes on everything. When I finished, he closed his folder and looked at me directly. "We're going to capture it," he said. "Why? Because something that can predict the future is too valuable to leave running loose in the mountains. Think about what we could do with that ability. Prevent terrorist attacks, avoid economic disasters, save thousands of lives. And if it doesn't want to be captured, then we'll make it want to cooperate." I knew what that meant. They'd cage it, study it, probably dissect it to figure out how its abilities worked. The creature that had been trying to save lives would become a government weapon, locked away in some underground facility where it would spend the rest of its existence predicting disasters for the military. That night, I went up to the mountain alone. Carol had been reassigned to a different district, the colonel's way of making sure she couldn't interfere with their plans. I sat in the observation tower, waiting. The creature appeared just after midnight. It landed on the roof of the station, and for the first time, I got a really good look at it. The photographs didn't do it justice. Up close, you could see that the gray skin wasn't skin at all, but something that looked almost like feathers. Though feathers that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The wings were magnificent, stretching wider than an eagle's, but with a structure that was somehow both bat-like and completely alien. But it was the eyes that held me. They weren't just glowing red dots. They were intelligent, ancient, and deeply sad. Looking into them was like staring into the eyes of something that had seen too much suffering and was tired of carrying the weight of knowledge it couldn't share. The creature looked at me for a long moment, then began tapping against the metal roof. More Morse code. "They come for me," I translated. "Tomorrow. Help." I stood up slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements. "I don't know how to help you," I said out loud, feeling foolish for talking to something that probably couldn't understand English. The creature tilted its head, studying me. Then it reached out with one massive hand and touched my forehead. The world exploded into vision. I saw the future. Not just one future, but dozens of possible futures, all branching out from this moment like the limbs of an enormous tree. In one, the military succeeded in capturing the creature, and within 6 months, it died in captivity. The disasters it would have prevented happened anyway, killing hundreds. In another, it escaped but was shot down by fighter jets. Its body recovered and studied until there was nothing left to study. But there was one future where it survived, where it continued its mission of preventing disasters, saving lives that would otherwise be lost. In that future, I helped it escape, and somehow managed to build a bridge between its kind and mine. The vision faded, leaving me gasping and disoriented. The creature was still standing on the roof, watching me with those ancient eyes. "You're not alone, are you?" I asked. "There are others like you." It nodded once, then spread its wings and launched itself into the darkness. I had less than 8 hours to figure out how to save something that might be the most important discovery in human history. The plan I came up with was simple, probably stupid, and definitely illegal, but it was the only chance the creature had. At 7 a.m., the military convoy arrived with enough equipment to capture King Kong. They had nets, tranquilizer weapons, electromagnetic pulse devices, and a transport cage that could have held a small elephant. Colonel Matthews was confident that within hours he'd have his prize. He didn't know that I'd spent the night sabotaging every piece of electronic equipment on the mountain. The radar systems that would have tracked the creature's approach were offline. The communication arrays that would have coordinated the capture operation were dead. Even the vehicle's GPS systems were scrambled, thanks to a few modifications I'd learned during my Air Force days. Technical difficulties? I explained when the colonel demanded to know why nothing was working. Solar flare activity has been playing havoc with electronics all week. It was a thin excuse, but it bought me time. While the military teams were trying to get their equipment working, I hiked to the spot where I'd first seen the creature's footprints. I didn't have to wait long. It appeared silently, landing in the same clearing where we'd first encountered it weeks ago. This time, it wasn't alone. 3 more creatures descended from the sky, each one unique, but sharing the same basic characteristics. Massive wings, glowing eyes, and that strange gray skin that seemed to drink light. They formed a circle around me, not threatening, just waiting. The original creature, the one I'd been communicating with, stepped forward and touched my forehead again. This time, the vision was different. Instead of possible futures, I saw the past. I watched as these beings, these Mothmen, had tried to warn humans about disasters for centuries. Sometimes they succeeded in preventing tragedies. Most of the time, they were dismissed as monsters or demons, hunted and killed for trying to help. I saw the truth about their mission. They weren't supernatural beings or aliens from another planet. They were something much more extraordinary. They were humans, evolved along a different path, developed from survivors of an ancient catastrophe who had gained the ability to perceive multiple timelines. They were our cousins, our brothers, trying to keep us from making the same mistakes that had nearly destroyed them. Why me? I asked out loud. The answer came not as words, but as understanding. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between their world and ours. Someone with the technical knowledge to understand their warnings and the credibility to pass them along. Someone who could see them not as monsters, but as allies. The sound of helicopters approaching broke the moment. The military had gotten at least some of their equipment working. Go, I told them. I'll handle this. But the lead creature shook its head. Instead, it reached into a pouch I hadn't noticed before and pulled out something that made my breath catch. It was a radio, but not like any radio I'd ever seen. The design was familiar yet advanced, as if someone had taken military communication equipment and improved it in ways that wouldn't be possible for decades. The creature handed it to me, then touched my forehead one last time. The final vision was the simplest and the most important. I saw myself continuing to work on Mount Pleasant, but now as something more than just a forest ranger. I was a liaison, a communication point between 2 species that had more in common than either realized. When disasters were about to happen, the Mothmen would contact me through their advanced radio system, and I would find ways to warn the appropriate authorities without revealing the source of my information. It wouldn't be easy. I'd have to be creative, careful, and sometimes willing to sacrifice my own reputation to save lives. But it was possible. It was a future where both species survived and prospered. When the vision ended, all 4 creatures were already lifting off. They rose into the sky just as the first military helicopter crested the mountain ridge, disappearing into the morning sun like they'd never been there at all. Colonel Matthews found me standing alone in the clearing, holding what appeared to be a standard military radio. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Gone," I said. "Flew away when it heard the helicopters coming." He didn't believe me, of course. His team scoured the mountain for the next 3 days, finding nothing but the footprints and broken branches we'd already documented. Eventually, they gave up and went back to Washington, filing a report that classified the incident as an unexplained wildlife encounter. I kept the radio. Over the next 30 years, I became very good at my new job. When the Mothmen contacted me about potential disasters, I found ways to pass along warnings that saved hundreds of lives. Sometimes I was a forest ranger who happened to notice structural problems with bridges. Sometimes I was a communications specialist who picked up faint distress signals from aircraft in trouble. Sometimes I was just a concerned citizen with a knack for being in the right place at the right time. I never saw Carol again, but I heard she'd started working for the National Weather Service, where she developed an unusual talent for predicting severe storms hours before they formed. I think she got her own radio. The government still doesn't know the truth about the Mothmen. They're listed in classified files as an unidentified aerial phenomena of possible extraterrestrial origin. That classification suits me fine. Let them think these creatures are aliens from another planet. It's safer than knowing they're actually our own distant relatives, trying to keep us from destroying ourselves the way their ancestors nearly did. I retired from active ranger duty 5 years ago, but I still live on Mount Pleasant. My replacement thinks I'm just a lonely old man who likes to hike the mountain trails at night. He doesn't know about the radio hidden in my equipment shed, or about the messages I receive when disaster is approaching. The Mothmen are still out there, still watching over us. They've learned to be more careful, more subtle in their warnings. But they haven't given up on us. Maybe that says something about the relationship between our species. Maybe it says something about hope. Or maybe it just says that some guardian angels have wings that span 15 feet and eyes that glow red in the darkness. Either way, I sleep better knowing they're watching. And sometimes, on clear nights when the moon is dark and the stars are bright, I climb up to the old observation station and scan the sky. Once in a while, I see them. Dark shapes moving against the starfield, too large to be birds, too graceful to be aircraft. When that happens, I wave. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear they wave back. The mountain keeps its secrets, but some secrets are worth keeping. My name is Peter Nightfall, and I've spent 46 years learning that the most important truths are often the ones we're not supposed to believe. My name is William Bloodmoon, and I've been a ranger at Red River Gorge for 21 years. In that time, I've tracked black bears through winter storms, pulled lost hikers out of cliff faces, and dealt with every kind of wildlife Kentucky has to offer. My Special Forces training taught me that every threat has a weakness. Every predator follows patterns you can learn. I thought I knew these mountains better than anyone. That was before October 1990, when the harvest moon hung fat and orange over the sandstone cliffs, and something started hunting people. The Daniel Boone National Forest covers thousands of acres of rough country. Red River Gorge sits right in the heart of it, with rock arches carved by wind and water, deep caves that go back for miles, and forests so thick you can walk 20 feet off the trail and disappear forever. It's beautiful country, but it's wild country, the kind of place where people still tell stories their great-grandparents heard. I never paid much attention to those stories. Mountain folk have always talked about strange things in the deep woods. Moonshiners used to blame missing batches on something with yellow eyes. Civil War veterans swore they'd seen soldiers who weren't quite human anymore, changed by the horrors they'd lived through. Old Cherokee families still whispered about curses that could turn a man into a beast when the moon was right. Stories. That's all I thought they were. My partner Jake Moonrunner felt different. Jake was Cherokee, born and raised in the mountains, and he listened to the old stories with respect. He'd grown up hearing his grandfather talk about the old ways, about times when the line between man and animal wasn't as clear as city people like to think. These mountains remember things, Jake would say when we were out on patrol. They've seen a lot of blood, a lot of pain. Sometimes that leaves marks. I'd laugh and shake my head. My job was dealing with real problems. Lost hikers, illegal campers, the occasional poacher. I didn't have time for ghost stories. That changed on October 15th, when Sarah Chen came running out of the woods. Sarah was an experienced backpacker, the kind who knew what she was doing out there. She'd been camping with her boyfriend Mark in the backcountry, 20 miles from the nearest road. When she stumbled into our ranger station that morning, she was shaking so hard she could barely talk. "Something's following us," she kept saying. "Something big. It's been watching our camp for 3 nights." Jake handed her coffee while I got out the incident report forms. "Can you describe what you saw?" "At first we thought it was a bear," Sarah said. "We'd hear it moving around our camp at night, breaking branches. But bears don't. Bears don't walk on 2 legs. I looked up from my paperwork. 2 legs? Mark saw it clearly the second night. He went out to check our food hang, and it was standing by the Tinyuwai Creek. Tall as a man, but wrong somehow. covered in dark fur, with a long snout and yellow eyes that reflected our flashlight. Standard protocol was to investigate any wildlife encounter that might involve an aggressive predator. But something about Sarah's description bothered me. Kentucky has black bears, but they rarely bother campers who follow proper food storage. And they certainly don't stand upright and stare people down. "Where's Mark now?" Jake asked. Sarah's face went white. He didn't make it out. "Last night, the thing came right into our camp. Mark told me to run, said he'd be right behind me. But when I looked back, she started shaking again. It had him. And it was dragging him toward the trees." Jake and I exchanged looks. A missing person changed everything. We called for backup, gathered our gear, and prepared to head into the backcountry. As we loaded the truck, Jake checked his equipment twice. Along with the standard ranger gear, he packed some items I didn't recognize. Small pouches of what looked like herbs, a necklace with carved symbols, and a knife with a strange silver blade. "Expecting something special out there?" I asked. Jake looked up at the afternoon sky, where the harvest moon was already visible as a pale ghost. "My grandfather always said to carry silver during harvest moon. Just in case, I should have listened to him." The hike into the backcountry took us 3 hours, following deer trails and creek beds through forests that seemed quieter than usual. Normally, these woods were full of sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as we got deeper into the gorge, the silence grew heavy around us. "Wildlife spooked," Jake observed, scanning the trees. "Something's got them running scared." We found Sarah and Mark's campsite just as the sun was setting. Their tent was shredded, sleeping bags scattered across the clearing, dark stains on the ground that could have been blood, but it was the tracks that made my skin crawl. They started as human footprints near the tent. Bare feet, large, with deep impressions that suggested someone heavy. But as the trail led away from the camp, the prints began to change. The heel marks deepened, toes elongated into claw marks. By the time the tracks reached the tree line, they were clearly animal, but bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. "This isn't right," I muttered, kneeling beside one of the clearer prints. "Looks like someone was walking normally then, changed." Jake was examining claw marks on a nearby oak tree. They started about 3 feet up and stretched to nearly 8 feet high. Whatever did this was big, and it was marking territory. We followed the trail as far as we could in the fading light, but it led deep into a section of the gorge where the rock formations created a maze of passages and dead ends. When full darkness fell, we had no choice but to make our own camp and wait for morning. That was our first mistake. I woke around midnight to the sound of something large moving through the trees beyond our campfire. Jake was already sitting up, his hand on that strange silver knife. "How long has it been out there?" I whispered. 20 minutes. It's circling us, staying just out of the light." We sat in silence, listening to the deliberate crack of branches as whatever it was moved around our camp. The sounds were wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too purposeful, like something that knew exactly what it was doing. Then we heard the breathing. It was deep and rough, coming from multiple directions at once, as if several large animals had surrounded us. But when I swept my flashlight across the tree line, I caught only glimpses of yellow eyes that reflected the light before disappearing. "Jake," I said quietly, "what exactly did your grandfather tell you about harvest moon?" He said, "There are some people who change when the moon is full. Not by choice. It's a curse that goes back generations, passed down through families or spread through." He paused. "Through bites." The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, we could hear our own hearts beating. Then something howled. It wasn't a wolf howl or a coyote call. It was deeper, more complex. Almost like a human voice trying to form words it couldn't quite remember. Other howls answered from different directions, creating a chorus that echoed off the stone walls of the gorge. "Pack hunters," Jake said. "They're coordinating." That's when I saw the first one clearly. It stepped into the edge of our firelight like it owned the place. 8 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur, with a wolf's head on a man's powerful body. Its eyes were intelligent, calculating. It looked at us the way a person might size up a problem. Then it smiled, showing teeth like white daggers. "Oh God," I breathed. "That's not an animal." More shapes moved in the darkness behind it. I counted at least 5, maybe more. They were talking to each other in low growls and huffs that sounded almost like a language. The leader, because that's clearly what it was, took a step closer. When it spoke, the words came out mangled by its changed throat, but they were definitely words. Where is the woman? My blood turned to ice. It was asking about Sarah. Jake was on his feet, silver knife in his hand. William, we need to move. Now. But we were surrounded. As the creatures closed in, I could see details that would haunt my nightmares. Some were fully transformed into wolf beasts. Others were caught partway between human and animal, with human hands ending in claws, or faces that were almost human except for the elongated jaws and fangs. One of them, I realized with horror, was wearing the torn remains of a hiking shirt. "Mark?" I called out. The thing that had been Mark Chen turned its yellow eyes toward me. For a moment, I saw recognition flicker there. Then it opened its mouth and let out a sound of pure anguish, part howl, part human scream. That's when Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the cliff face behind our camp. "There's a cave back here," he shouted. "Move!" We ran for our lives as the pack gave chase, their howls echoing off the rocks like the screams of the damned. The cave Jake led us to was barely wide enough for a man, but it went back into the cliff face, further than our flashlights could reach. We squeezed through the opening just as claws raked across the stone where we'd been standing. The creatures couldn't follow us into the narrow passage, but they didn't give up. For hours, we listened to them, scratching at the entrance, testing for weak spots. Sometimes one would try to squeeze partway in, filling the opening with fur and rage and the smell of wet earth. "This is temporary," Jake said, checking his gear. "They're smart enough to wait us out." We were trapped, but at least we had time to think. I tried to process what we'd seen. "Those weren't animals, Jake. Some of them were people. Changed people. Lycanthropy," he said simply. "Werewolves? My grandfather's stories were true." "That's impossible." Jake looked at me in the dim light of our flashlight. "You saw them. You heard one of them talk. How do you explain that?" I couldn't. Everything I'd been trained to believe about the natural world was crumbling around me. But I was still a ranger, still responsible for protecting people. "How many are out there?" "At least 6 in the pack we saw, but there could be more." Jake pulled out a small leather pouch. "My grandfather said lycanthropy spreads through bites. During the full moon, anyone who's been infected transforms. They hunt together, and they create more of their kind." "How long has this been going on?" "The stories go back over 100 years. Always the same pattern. People disappear during harvest moon, especially in years when the moon is particularly full and bright. The attacks happen in cycles." I thought about the missing person reports I'd filed over the years. Hikers who vanished without a trace, camping gear found abandoned, families that never got answers. Jesus. How many people have they taken? Before Jake could answer, we heard new sounds from outside the cave. Human voices, calling for help. "Hello? Is anyone out there? Please help us." A woman's voice, desperate and afraid. Then a man's voice joined in. "We're lost. We can hear you moving around out there." Jake grabbed my arm as I started toward the cave entrance. "Don't. It's a trap." "What if it's real hikers?" "Listen to the voices. Really listen." I focused on the calls for help. At first they sounded normal, but after a few minutes, I began to notice things. The woman's voice had an odd echo to it. The man's words were slightly slurred, like someone trying to talk with their mouth full. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Between the calls for help, I could hear low growling and what sounded like pack communication. "They're learning," Jake whispered. "The newly transformed ones still remember how to be human. They're using those memories against us." The fake distress calls continued for another hour, growing more sophisticated. They added details about being injured, about having children with them, about seeing other campers who needed rescue. If we hadn't been watching them transform earlier, I might have believed it. Finally, the sounds moved away. But Jake made us wait until dawn before venturing out. When we emerged from the cave, our campsite was destroyed. Not just scattered, deliberately shredded. Our gear was spread across a wide area, sleeping bags torn to ribbons, food containers crushed. But it was arranged in a specific pattern, like a message. "They're intelligent," I said, examining the destruction. This isn't random animal behavior. Jake was studying tracks around the site. Look at this. The ground was covered with prints, but not just animal tracks. There were human footprints too, barefoot impressions that started normal but gradually elongated and deepened as they moved away from our camp. They're changing back and forth, Jake explained. When the moon sets, they return to human form. But as long as the curse is active, they'll keep transforming. We followed the tracks to a section of the gorge I'd never explored before. Hidden among the rock formations was an opening that led to a much larger cave system. The smell that came from inside was overwhelming. Animal musk mixed with something else. Something rotten. Their den, Jake said grimly. We needed backup, but our radio wouldn't reach the ranger station from this deep in the gorge. We'd have to hike out and come back with help, but as we turned to leave, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A human voice, weak but definitely human, calling from somewhere inside the cave system. Help, please. Someone help me. This time it was real. I could tell the difference now. There's someone alive in there, I told Jake. It could be bait again. No, listen to the breathing, the way the voice carries. That's a real person. Jake checked his silver knife and the contents of his medicine pouch. If we go in there, we might not come out. If we don't, whoever's in there definitely won't come out. We had a decision to make. Walk away and get help, knowing that by the time we returned with backup, it would probably be too late. Or go into the lycanthrope den ourselves and try to save whoever was trapped inside. I thought about all the families who'd never gotten answers about their missing loved ones. About Mark Chen, who might still be human enough to save. We're going in, I decided. But we do this. Jake nodded and began preparing his grandfather's remedies. Then we'd better understand what we're dealing with. According to the old stories, lycanthropes are strongest during the full moon, weakest just before dawn. They're vulnerable to silver, but only if it's blessed properly. And they're still human inside, which means they can be reasoned with, if you know how. What about the curse? Can it be broken? Maybe. But it requires a ritual, specific timing, and... Jake hesitated. Usually the willing sacrifice of the one who created the pack. We prepared our gear and entered the cave system, not knowing if we were walking into a rescue mission or our own deaths. The cave system was bigger than we'd expected, with passages leading off in multiple directions. We followed the sound of the human voice deeper into the mountain, using Jake's knowledge of Cherokee cave navigation and my military training to avoid getting lost. The smell grew stronger as we went deeper. It wasn't just animal musk, it was the scent of fear, of people who'd been trapped in darkness for days or weeks. And underneath it all, something else, something that reminded me of battlefields. We found them in a large chamber about a quarter mile into the cave system. 7 people, all in various stages of transformation. Some were fully human, but chained to the cave wall with what looked like old iron shackles. Others were partially changed. Human bodies with wolf-like features, or faces that shifted between human and animal as we watched. They were conscious but trapped in bodies they couldn't control. And in the center of the chamber, directing the others with growls and gestures, was the Alpha. He was massive, easily 8.5 feet tall, covered in silver-gray fur that marked him as the pack leader. But when he turned to face us, I saw something in his yellow eyes that was purely human. Intelligence, recognition, and terrible, ancient sadness. "Rangers," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow formed clear words. "You should not have come here." "We're here to help," Jake said, holding his silver knife ready but not threatening. "These people don't have to stay cursed." The Alpha laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Help? I have been trying to help for 70 years. Do you know what it's like to lose your humanity one night each month? To wake up covered in blood and not remember whose blood it is? Then let us break the curse. The curse cannot be broken. Believe me, I have tried everything." The Alpha gestured to the chained people around the chamber. "These are the newest ones. I restrain them during their first transformations to keep them from hurting innocents. But eventually, they all join the hunt. The hunger becomes too strong." I realized what we were looking at. This wasn't just a lycanthrope den, it was a prison. The Alpha was trying to control his pack, trying to minimize the damage they caused. "How did it start?" I asked. The Alpha's form shimmered, becoming more human as he concentrated on speech. Civil War. My unit was trapped behind enemy lines, starving, desperate. We found a Cherokee medicine man who offered us power to survive. We thought he meant strength, endurance. We didn't understand the price. Jake stepped forward. What was the medicine man's name? Walks with Wolves. He said we had dishonored the land with our war, and we would pay by becoming the beasts we already were inside. Jake's face went pale. Walks with Wolves was my great-great-grandfather. The stories say he placed curses on soldiers who desecrated Cherokee burial grounds. Then you know how to break it. Maybe. But it requires the willing sacrifice of the original pack leader during the peak of transformation. The Alpha nodded slowly. I have lived with this curse for 70 years. I have seen it spread to dozens of innocent people. I am ready to die if it means freeing them. But before we could discuss the ritual, we heard howls echoing through the cave system. The other pack members were returning. Dawn is coming, the Alpha said urgently. During transformation back to human form, the pack is most vulnerable. If you're going to perform the ritual, it has to be now. Jake began pulling items from his medicine pouch, herbs, carved symbols, and a small container of what looked like blessed oil. I need you to maintain the circle while I prepare the Cherokee cleansing ritual. The sounds of the approaching pack grew louder. Through the cave entrance, I could see the first hints of dawn light. The chained prisoners began to moan and writhe as their transformation started to reverse. That's when the pack burst into the chamber. 6 massive werewolves, moving with coordinated purpose. But something was wrong with them. Their eyes weren't intelligent like the Alphas, they were wild, feral. These weren't people fighting to maintain their humanity. These were creatures that had given in completely to the curse. The new ones, the Alpha growled, placing himself between us and the attacking pack. They have forgotten how to be human. The fight that followed was unlike anything my military training had prepared me for. These weren't just large predators. They were supernaturally strong and fast, with human intelligence guiding their animal instincts. Jake worked frantically to complete the ritual while I used my rifle and the Alpha fought his own pack, but conventional bullets barely slowed them down. Only Jake's silver knife seemed to cause real damage. "William," Jake shouted over the snarling and gunfire. "I need the Alpha in the center of the circle when I finish the incantation." The Alpha was holding his own against 3 werewolves, but he was outnumbered. I made a decision that went against every survival instinct I had. I dropped my useless rifle and grabbed the silver knife from Jake. The blade felt strange in my hand, warm and almost alive. When I drove it into the nearest werewolf's shoulder, the creature screamed and fell back, silver fire spreading from the wound. "The knife is blessed," Jake called out. "It will hurt them, but only killing the Alpha during the ritual will break the curse." I fought my way to the Alpha's side. Together, we drove the pack back long enough for Jake to complete his preparations. "I'm ready," Jake announced. "But this has to be the Alpha's choice." The pack leader looked at me with eyes that held 70 years of guilt and pain. "Tell the families. Tell them their loved ones fought the curse as long as they could." He stepped into Jake's ritual circle, just as the silver fire from his own transformation began to consume him. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Silver light exploded from the circle, washing over every werewolf in the chamber. The pack members collapsed, their wolf forms dissolving as the curse was broken. The chained prisoners completed their transformations back to human form and stayed human. When the light faded, the Alpha was gone. In his place lay an old man in tattered Civil War uniform, finally at peace. We got the survivors out of the cave system as the sun rose fully over Red River Gorge. 7 people who had been missing for periods ranging from 3 weeks to 6 months, all alive but traumatized by their experience. The official report listed it as a cave rescue following a coordinated animal attack. The survivors were treated for exposure, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Most of them had fragmented memories of their time as lycanthropes, remembering it like a nightmare they couldn't quite shake. Mark Chen was among the survivors. He had enough memory of his transformation to understand what had happened, but not enough to be completely broken by it. Sarah was waiting at the hospital when we brought him out. Jake and I were debriefed by officials who seemed to know more about supernatural incidents than they were willing to admit. We were sworn to secrecy about certain details, and recruited for a classified program that monitored supernatural threats in national forests. But the experience changed us both in ways that couldn't be covered up in official reports. I found myself paying attention to the old stories now, working with Cherokee elders and other traditional leaders to understand the spiritual history of the land I was supposed to protect. Jake became my partner in this unofficial role, bridging the gap between government agencies and indigenous knowledge. We established early warning systems in mountain communities, teaching people to recognize signs of supernatural activity. We trained other rangers to handle encounters with things that weren't in any manual, and we kept silver ammunition in our emergency kits, just in case. Because we learned that the lycanthrope pack wasn't the only supernatural threat hiding in the mountains. The old stories were full of other creatures, other curses, other dangers that most people preferred to pretend didn't exist. 3 months after the Harvest Moon incident, I was promoted to head of special investigations for the region. My job, officially, is to handle unusual wildlife encounters and unexplained disappearances. Unofficially, I'm the guy they call when rangers report things that shouldn't exist. Jake became a cultural liaison, working with tribal authorities to preserve traditional knowledge about supernatural threats. His grandfather's stories weren't just folklore, they were survival guides passed down through generations of people who knew the real dangers hiding in wild places. We never talk about it publicly, but other rangers know they can come to us when they encounter something that doesn't fit in normal reports. We've handled 3 more supernatural incidents since the werewolf pack, each one stranger than the last. The mountains still hold old magic, old curses, old debts that haven't been paid. And sometimes, especially during the full moon, you can still hear howling echo through the gorges of Red River. Not from wolves, but from the spirits of those who died cursed, warning others to stay away from places where the line between human and beast grows thin. I tell new rangers to respect the old stories, to listen when local people share their knowledge, and to always carry something silver when they're working alone in the deep woods. Because I learned that some legends are true, and the ones that are true are usually the ones you most need to believe. My name is William Bloodmoon, and I've been protecting these mountains for over 30 years now. I've seen things that would break most people's understanding of reality, but I've also seen the power of human courage, the strength that comes from respecting the old ways, and the importance of standing guard against the darkness that lives just beyond the firelight. The harvest moon still rises every October, full and orange and beautiful. But now I know what else it illuminates in the shadows.